A young woman with a troubled background suddenly controls a $1 million property in New Hampshire. How? She had found a way of tempting the old man who'd owned the farm.
She bared her breasts. She exposed herself, sent photos of herself in very sensual positions, and she got a response. And that's how she ended up in her relationship with this man who eventually dies. And as a result of his death, now she has this house.
Soon after, young, vulnerable men down on their luck are seen coming and going. Neighbours fear that the farm is harbouring a grim secret.
Coming down the wooden path, they saw a man stumbling and bleeding from the head. He was Michael Deloge, and he just said one word: Sheila.
Another young man, Kenneth Countie, was hooked on the older woman who had taken him in. His mother appealed for him to come home.
You don't want to be with a 47-year-old. There's ulterior motives there. No. And Kenny said, no, she loves me.
Kenneth Countie would become the second man killed at the hands of Sheila Labarre. Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Sheila Labarre as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake? On a farm just outside Epping in New Hampshire, detectives answering a call related to the disappearance of this man come across a grisly sight.
So they went over and took a look inside. And what they found in there was a human bone. And on the knob of the bone was some human flesh. So now they are very worried about what has happened to Kenneth Countie.
Weeks earlier, Kenny's mother was convinced that her son had suffered harm at the hands of a woman called Sheila Labarre. She feared he was possibly dead. She wanted a detective, a man called Cody, to check that Sheila Labarre had not killed Kenny.
Detective Cody said, no, there was no reason to. And I said, is she going to kill my son? Because at that point, and that was in the very beginning, at that point, I knew something wasn't right. And he said, no, she's known to the Epping police and she would never do that.
Who was Sheila Labarre? What had happened to Kenneth Countie? Why was there a human bone on a bonfire? Questions which would gradually be answered as police tried to uncover a killer's mistake. First, they had to find out about the characters in what appeared a disturbing and bizarre story. Sheila Labarre had been known as Sheila Bailey during an unsettled childhood.
Sheila was born in a very small town in Alabama named Fort Payne. Sheila's childhood was very troubled. Her older sister says that Sheila was the subject of sexual abuse from her father and from other men.
Kenneth Countie had a troubled childhood too. When little more than a baby, his mother noticed he was behind others in his age range.
Kenny started having delayment in his academics. I brought him to the hospital. I brought him back and forth to the hospital to make sure that there was nothing wrong. At the time he was 1.5, I noticed that he started doing some clicking noises in front of the TV. He was taking petite seizures. So I brought him to the Children's Hospital, and they did a CAT scan and they did an MRI, and they found out that the left side of the brain never grew. And so that, added to Kenny's problems.
As he grew older, Kenny always appeared timid. Despite a tough start and his learning difficulties, he appeared to many to be a standard young man. Likeable too.
Kenny was a very trusting guy, but he was looking for his way in the world. He had very loving family. His mother really took care of him. She understood that things were more difficult for Kenny than they were for other people.
Sheila Labarre, born 20 years before Kenny, had suffered even before puberty. She had been sexualized by abusive men.
She grew up in a very abusive environment, was displayed as a sexual toy, was passed around to older grown men, friends of her father's, as a sexual object.
Sheila's father was often drunk and frequently violent. Her mother, Ruby, did what she could to protect her daughters, but it wasn't enough.
A teenage Sheila Bailey longed to escape this violent, small-town life. She dreamed of becoming an artist, a model, perhaps a singer, but in the end, she chose an easier route to financial independence. She found herself a man. But the abused woman would become a negligent stepmother.
Sheila was very young at the time. She was about, I think, 18 or 19 years old when she married John. He was a lineman for the county, and he was recently divorced and had a young daughter named Wendy.
Already, she was showing signs of being a disturbed, damaged individual.
Sheila was not the most maternal person. Wendy told her father that when he would go to work, Sheila would take care of her by making her drink something. Brandy, maybe it's cough syrup, something that made her feel very sleepy. And it was also then that Sheila would put Wendy in the closet.
When John found out, he kicked Sheila out. The marriage lasted just 6 weeks.
At this time, Sheila had little trouble ensnaring the men that she'd set her sights on.
For many years, Sheila had a very curvy body, and she was very beautiful and was really able to maximize her sex appeal to get what she wanted.
Pretty soon after her first marriage ended, Sheila Bailey had claimed a second husband. It was to be another brief, unhappy marriage.
Sheila's second husband was a guy by the name of Ronnie Jennings. He worked at a restaurant in town, and Sheila fell hard for him. She basically wants to be loved. She wants to have a normal life. She thinks that Ronnie can provide that.
Sheila becomes Sheila Bailey Jennings. Friends of the happy couple might have thought that the stage was set for a long, happy marriage. Perhaps the bride could at last leave behind her traumatic childhood and her short-lived first marriage, settle down for good. It wasn't to be. The union between Sheila and Ronnie was soon to disintegrate, giving way to violence and infidelity.
Trauma in early life can have an impact later on, and it seems like Sheila was starting to abuse the people around her in the same ways that she had been abused herself.
She takes out her frustrations on Ronnie. She's abusive to him. And he decides that he doesn't want to be in the relationship anymore.
She took pills, sped off, and got into a pretty bad car accident. It looked like she was trying to kill herself.
Sheila survived the suicide attempt, but for a while was very unwell, comatose in fact. When she came round, she had an extraordinary tale to tell.
When she came back, she told everybody that she had died, gone to heaven, and God had sent her back as an avenging angel. And this was the persona that she carried with her throughout the rest of her life, and it sort of became the basis of her rationalization to kill.
Sheila told anyone who would listen that she was indeed an avenging angel sent by God to kill paedophiles, and that she saw herself as a protector of children. Was this truly what Sheila believed, or simply an excuse to commit unspeakable acts of violence against every man who had the misfortune to cross her path? One day, a jury would be asked that very question as they considered, had she killed Kenny Countie? By the end of her second marriage, Sheila had committed no crimes that attracted the attention of the police. She was on no one's radar screen of investigation. In 1987, she began looking for husband number 3 and set her sights on a doctor, Wilfred Labarre.
He was a widower. He lived on a horse farm in rural New Hampshire. And Sheila found a Lonely Hearts ad in a newspaper that Dr. Labarre had set up. He was very lonely after losing his wife and wanted companionship.
She just didn't write and say what she was looking for in a man, long romantic walks on a beach. She got right down to the point. She bared her breasts. She exposed herself, sent photos of herself in very sensual positions.
Well, he fell pretty hard for her. Sheila immediately got on a plane and began dating Wilfrid Labarre. And she insinuated herself into his life almost immediately.
Sheila moved in with Wilfrid to become the mistress of a 100-acre horse farm in idyllic rural New Hampshire. It was the stuff of dreams, a far cry from the poverty and squalor of her Alabama childhood.
Sheila was now engaged in a relationship with somebody that could very well at least be the age of her father. And as a result, she was able, and she's this beautiful woman at the time, and she's able to manipulate and control because the older man is looking at Sheila. This is one of life's bonuses. How could somebody like himself get this beautiful young woman at the time? And so she used that. That was Sheila's web. She was able to suck him in and eventually use that to her advantage.
She moved to the farm. She started to take over his chiropractic business. She became the office manager and basically ran off all of the other employees that were, who could see through her. She separated Dr. Labarre from his grown kids.
The couple never married, but Sheila took his surname. She became Sheila Labarre. She's known around town as something completely different.
Sheila is a beautiful woman. She immediately gets attention in town for wearing tight clothes. In fact, people around town gave her a nickname. They called her Sheila the Peeler. They were always hoping that she would maybe flash a little this or show a little bit of that. And she got that reputation because, well, she had no problem coming to the door for delivery men wearing almost nothing.
In the quiet farming community of Epping, Sheila Labarre became notorious.
Everybody in town knows that Sheila Labarre is an unusual figure and that she is both treacherous and she is seductive.
Even the local police department, who over the following years would have many encounters with Sheila Labarre, came to be wary of her provocative behavior.
When they would go to call, she would often be in very scantily dressed clothes and sometimes just drop it and bare it all to them, with everything showing. And so officers knew when you get a call at Sheila the Peeler's house, you call for backup. Make sure somebody is there.
People at first might have worried that she was a troubled woman who needed help, not censure and gossip, but Sheila Labarre appeared to be a woman who was very much in control. The sexual relationship between Sheila and Wilfrid was short-lived. Within a year, she effectively had ownership of her lover's property and his business.
When Sheila sucks him in through this relationship, she convinces him to give her power of attorney, to sign over property, and he does, because he doesn't want to lose her. He perhaps maybe doesn't feel worthy to have somebody at the time as beautiful as Sheila, but she's able to use what she believes is her beauty and charm to convince him to basically sign over everything.
She ended up spending 17 years with Wilfrid, but soon after she had taken over effective control of the farm and the business, she told him he was not to consider himself as her wife or partner. She would be free to live the life of a single woman. Why did Wilfrid Labarre continue to let her control his life and his livelihood?
One of the questions that's hardest to answer is, why did Dr. Labarre stay with Sheila? Why did he keep her in his life when it seems like it would be so easy to just push her away? Somebody posed this question to Dr. Labarre. Why keep Sheila around? She's making you miserable. She's taking your money. And all he could say was, she's got too much on me.
She ran his chiropractic business with a heavy hand, bullying patients into paying, scaring off employees that she didn't see eye to eye with. She also abused the doctor physically. A lieutenant with Epping Police would later testify that he'd been called to the farm many times over the years that Sheila lived there. On one occasion, he was responding to a call about a domestic disturbance and arrived to find Bill with deep scratches all over his face and neck.
Basically, she worked to isolate Dr. Labarre and to take over his life and his property.
What hold did Sheila Labarre have over the men that she abused? How did she make them stay with her, stop them lashing out at her in retaliation, or even pressing charges against her?
Sheila has an interesting habit of recording her telephone calls and her conversations.
Something Kenny Countie's mother was to discover years later when Sheila played her recordings of conversations that she'd had with Kenny.
And it was very, very graphic. And I was dumbfounded. At that time, when I got that tape, I didn't want to see him anymore. I didn't want to talk to him. Because it was just so, it was horrible. It was horrible.
And part of a pattern of behaviour. Catch a man, record him saying things which would incriminate him, and then control him.
She wanted to make sure that the people she was involved in a relationship, that she had utter, complete, 100% control, much like her father had complete control over her. So she isolated them, almost a brainwashing technique. You isolate someone and you can have vast influence over that person, so therefore she would have that ultimate control, much like a puppet master.
And all of this kept quiet down on the farm, her own world, one kept free from prying eyes. Even though they were no longer officially romantically involved, Sheila Labarre continued to control the home, the business and the money of Dr. Wilfred Labarre. She was so confident that he wouldn't kick her out, she started to bring home men.
Wayne Ennis was a handyman. He was a migrant farm worker from Jamaica. He was doing some work at the clinic.
It wasn't all smooth sailing. In 1995, Sheila filed a report with the Epping police accusing Wayne Ennis of attacking her. She got a restraining order against Wayne, but despite that, the same year they got married.
Sheila gets married to Wayne Ennis and brings him back to the farm. And the three of them are now living on the farm together.
Sheila had kept Dr. Labarre's last name. She was living on his farm, had control over his finances, but now she wanted him gone.
Wayne is very troubled one day when Sheila approaches him and says, we need to get rid of Dr. Labarre. If he's gone, we will inherit this property. More specifically, Sheila will inherit this property. That's because Sheila has wrestled power of attorney from Dr. Labarre. So she stands to inherit anything if something befalls the doctor. And now she's intimating to Wayne Ennis that he needs to do something to hasten Dr. Labarre's death. Wayne is very troubled by this, so he goes to Dr. Labarre and tells him what Sheila is planning. And he's fearful as well for his own safety. Dr. Labarre then drove Wayne to a bus station, got him on a bus, and he got out of town, and Sheila never saw him again.
Wilfred Labarre had voluntarily given up the running of his home and farm. Wayne Ellis had gone without reporting what she had asked him to do, so Sheila remained living on the farm, simply waiting for her next victim to come along.
James Brackett had a low IQ and his speech was slow. He was 10 years younger than Sheila and he was one of Dr. Labarre's patients, but it didn't take long for Sheila to move him onto the farm.
Sheila is, coquettish, she's manipulative, she knows how to get what she wants out of a man, but she is also cruel. And that is one of the things that she demonstrates with James Brackett. She ends up being very abusive to him. She strikes him in the face with a scrubbing brush.
It was horrific abuse, and like all of the others, he was too afraid to leave.
James Brackett stayed on the farm almost 5 years. Midway through that time, Wilfred Labarre died.
Dr. Labarre died in 2000. Sheila told Dr. Labarre's family that just one day he'd had a heart attack and and died on the kitchen floor. And she insisted that he be cremated. It wasn't until later that people thought that this was suspicious. At the time, nobody thought much about Dr. Labarre's death, that it was anything other than natural causes.
The autopsy showed that Wilfred had died of a massive heart attack, hypertension, arterial sclerosis, and high blood pressure. Little wonder, perhaps, given the abuse that he had suffered for over 20 years at Sheila's hands. But there was no apparent crime. His death marked a turning point in Sheila's treatment of men.
When Dr. Labarre passed away, there was nobody there to keep her in check.
Sheila now owned the farm outright. She could control who came and went. There was no one to witness what she was doing, and there was no one to stop her or intervene. Her abuse of James Brackett continued and got worse.
She one time, chased him off the property and fired a shot over his head. She even chased him into a horse trailer that was in the barn, and she chased him with an axe and tried to chop her way through the trailer where he is huddled up inside. That's like a scene out of The Shining.
Sheila Labarre's life was never normal, but her behavior after Wilfred's death was increasingly out of control. She smoked marijuana every day, sometimes took tranquilizers.
She got involved with sex chat lines, recording the conversations, and she would often force James to listen to them, to share in her sadistic and unusual fantasies. She was violent towards him on a daily basis. On one occasion, she gouged his eye, leaving him bleeding, and on another occasion, she drove a car straight at him.
Men frequently came and went to Silver Leopard Farm, as Sheila had renamed it, or at least they arrived. They came as farmhands, or as Sheila's latest love interest. After a while, Sheila would tell anyone who'd listen that they just upped and left, that she had no idea where they'd gone. But had they? Some were never seen again. James Brackett made several attempts to leave, once even hiking through a blizzard to a local homeless shelter. Eventually, he escaped.
It wasn't until much later that he was essentially rescued from the farm by his relatives. And James Brackett considers himself lucky to be alive today.
The next young man to be ensnared by Sheila wouldn't be so lucky. He was called Michael Deloge.
Michael Deloge was a drifter. He came from Connecticut and wound up in a homeless shelter in New Hampshire.
She was able to suck those men in, almost like a spider in a spider web, bringing them into their cave where she eventually would kill them.
Michael was estranged from his ex-wife and young child. He had substance abuse problems, he was unemployed, he was desperate, alone, and vulnerable.
The prospect of staying in a homeless shelter or going with this woman to a farm where he could get a nice warm bed and a steady job and sex, well, that's a very easy decision to make.
Less than a year later, Michael disappeared. What had happened to him? His parents had become worried. What little contact they'd had dwindled to almost nothing. They were right to worry.
There were fears for Michael's safety and rumors of violence. On one occasion, she attacked him and almost severed his ear.
The neighbors describe an incident in the winter where, coming down the wooden path from the horse farm, they saw a man stumbling and bleeding from the head. It was Michael Deloge, and he just walked right past a neighbor and said one word: Sheila.
Terrified for his safety, Michael's mum, Donna, pleaded with her son to leave. Sheila was furious. What she did next would shed some light on a mystery. How she'd been able to keep beaten and abused men like Michael under her thumb for so long.
Sheila then sent Donna a video in which Michael accused Donna of allowing him to be sexually abused as a child. But in the video, his face is scratched and bruised.
Sheila has isolated Michael from his family, therefore he wouldn't be missed.
Not only is she isolating him from his family, but she's also poisoning the relationship and getting into his head until he believes it. He actually believes that he is a child molester because she has told him that so many times.
None of this was true. The men she had snared had not committed crimes, but making incriminating recordings had become part of Sheila's MO, the way she kept her victims compliant.
Sheila has an interesting habit of recording her telephone calls and her conversations. At one point, she had over 300 cassette tapes of things of her on the telephone.
Was this what Wilfred Labarre had meant all those years ago when he told a friend, "She has too much on me"? Either way, Wilfred had died of apparently natural causes. Another man had run as fast as he could away from the farm. Now Michael had gone. Men just didn't seem to last very long down on the farm with Sheila Labarre. In 2005, Sheila Labarre was alone again. She didn't like that, so she started looking for a new, younger man.
She was using telephone dating services where you would leave a message in somebody's voicemail box. And Sheila had a habit of screening the calls. And if the man sounded confident, if he sounded like he really had it all together, she would delete those messages. If the guy sounded meek, if he sounded like he might not be of high intelligence, if he sounded like he was somebody that she could manipulate, she kept those messages and contacted those guys.
Guys like Kenneth Countie. Kenneth was a young man looking for love, acceptance, independence. It was this longing that drew him to Sheila Labarre, and within just a month of that first meeting, led him to his brutal death at the age of 24. His journey began with a need to be independent.
Kenny's mother, Carolyn, had always tried to do her best for him, and as he got older, that meant letting him go his own way and make his own decisions, even if she worried desperately about him.
He decided, well, I'm going to join the army, I'm going to protect our country. And he said to me, can you take me down to Lowell? I'm going to sign up for the army. And I couldn't believe he was going to do this. And I said, no, honey, you don't want to do this. And he said, no, Ma, I'm going to.
Kenny enlisted, and Carolyn prayed that at long last something would go right for her son. For a while, it seemed like his luck had changed.
I went up to a soldier, and I tapped him, and I said, do you know Kenneth Countie? I said, I'm looking for Kenneth Countie, I'm his mother. And he looked at me, he said, Ma, it's me. I didn't even recognize him. He had muscle, he was handsome, and he stood proud, and he did everything that a soldier did. I could see the life in his eyes.
But it wasn't to be. Kenny didn't graduate. It was to be the beginning of the end for his short, troubled life.
The day before his graduation, I got a phone call from Captain Pasquale saying that Kenny wasn't graduating. And the day of graduation, my son was directing traffic. And at that point, I looked in his eyes and they were dead. They were dead.
One of the most disappointing things in his life was that he couldn't graduate with his class and got drummed out of the Army. You know, it really could have changed his life for the better. Instead, he had to move back to Massachusetts and try to make a go of it.
Kenny was at his lowest ebb. He had become severely depressed. He had attempted suicide. He was at his most vulnerable. And for Sheila, he was ripe for the picking.
When Kenny spoke of his meeting with Sheila, Carolyn knew straight away something was wrong.
They met on a chat line. Come to find out, when I found out in court, it was a sex chat line.
Kenny meets Sheila at a fancy bar overlooking the ocean. And they have a few drinks, and they move from the bar to the back seat of Sheila's car, where they have sex. A few days later, Kenny goes to his roommate and says, I'm moving out. I'm moving to New Hampshire to live on this horse farm with my new girlfriend.
He was only 24, she was in her 40s, 47. She drank, she was loud. She was obnoxious. She went to his place in Wilmington, and she told the roommate that she just wanted him to come to her place for dinner and that she'd return him. So he didn't take any clothes, he didn't take anything. And once he got into the car, that was the end. He never returned.
Kenneth Countie's mother would never see him again. How long did it take Kenny to realise what a grievous error he had made in getting into that car? Carolyn was alarmed enough that she immediately contacted Epping police. A female officer took the call.
She sent the police to Sheila's house, and Sheila didn't like that because of the fact that I sent the police to her house for a well-being check.
When Kenny is not returning mom's phone calls, that's a red flag. Kenny's mom has to find out what is going on. Is he okay? So she contacted the police in Epping, New Hampshire. So the patrolmen go to Sheila's farm and they knock on the door and they say, "We want to talk to Kenny." And she says he can't come to the door. He's taking a bath. They insist. And so Kenny comes to the door. He's wearing a towel. He's wet. But he seems to be okay.
Kenny might have been physically fine on that first visit by police, but Sheila was livid. How dare Carolyn report her? How dare local cops challenge her on her own property? She was not going to take the intrusion lying down.
Kenny has moved to Sheila's farm, and Sheila is doing the same pattern as she had for all the other men. And that starts with cutting him off from her family.
Sheila's response to this, when Kenny had been on the farm just a couple days, was to make a shocking tape which she played on the phone for his mother.
She had him saying all these horrible things about me, that I sexually molested him when he was a baby, that I continued to do that when I went to England.
Once again, as with Michael Deloge, James Brackett and perhaps Wilfrid Labarre, Sheila was using accusations of paedophilia to control her victims and isolate them from their families.
And it was very, very graphic. I think at that time it was for me to back off. Oh, definitely, because I sent the police to her house.
Carolyn was devastated, but if Sheila had hoped that she would back off, she was mistaken. Carolyn continued trying to call her son at the farm. When she couldn't get hold of him, she repeatedly contacted local police, begging them to check on him, to remove him from the farm, anything to protect him from this scheming woman. That's the way she saw it. On one occasion, local police denied outright that Sheila was dangerous.
He told me that she would take young men to her farm and they'd work the farm, and then she'd call the police department to say that they left. Well, I found that pretty bizarre, and I said, well, how do you know they left? How do you know she didn't hurt them? She could have killed them. Did she kill them? And they started laughing. He said, no, that's not Sheila's MO.
There's nothing stronger in life often than a mother's love. And because of a mother's love for her child and refusing to accept the answers that were being given to her, she pushed and pushed and pushed and stayed in touch with the police and just wasn't satisfied with the answers she was hearing.
When the police had first visited Kenny a few days after arriving at Sheila's farm, he seemed to be doing fine. But the next time he was seen in public, his mental and physical well-being had dramatically deteriorated.
Weeks later, when these officers see Kenny at the Walmart, Sheila took Kenny to Walmart and he was unable to walk through the aisles himself. She was pushing him in a wheelchair. His face was a weird color, and he had bruises and cuts and burns.
His face was all cut up. His hands were all cut up. One of them was immobile. His head was down. He was ashen in color. He was all cut up, and he was in a wheelchair, and he couldn't walk.
What had happened to Kenneth Countie, and what did Sheila Labarre have planned for him next? Her sinister shopping list that day should perhaps have given officers who spoke to her a clue. She certainly hadn't popped in for a few groceries.
Sheila was there shopping with Kenny, and the thing that she was buying were diesel fuel cans. And she made Kenny hold these fuel cans as she shopped.
They escorted her, and they're laughing. And she told, when they asked Kenny if he was all right, his head was hanging, he was drooling, and she told him to shut the F up. At that point, the police should have taken him. They didn't. They watched her take him to the car and lift him from the wheelchair into the car.
When Epping police told Carolyn about the sighting of Kenny, she was beside herself with fear. Once again, she pleaded with them to do something to save her son.
And I said, and you let her take him, knowing that I was looking for him, seeing the way he looked. I said, you let Sheila take my son, she's going to kill him. And he said, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do. And she killed him 2 days later.
On March 23, 2006, Sheila Labarre called the local police chief and told him that Kenny had left her. Over the phone, she played cops an audio recording of Kenny confessing to a long list of truly disturbing crimes.
And Sheila says, he left, and I can prove it, and I can tell you why he left. And so she plays over the telephone a tape recording that she made of Kenny. And what the officer heard was Sheila berating Kenny and getting him to confess that he was a child molester and that he had abused kids. On the tape, the officer could hear Kenny becoming weaker. And at one point, he heard Kenny vomit. And then he thought he heard Kenny faint because Sheila was saying, "Get up, you can't fake fainting."
Kenny was clearly really unwell when the recording was made. She claimed to have identified a dangerous pedophile and was forcing Kenny to confess to things that he'd never done.
Panic-stricken, Carolyn filed another missing persons report. But it was too late. When police the next day visited Sheila's place, they found strong evidence that Kenny hadn't simply walked away from the farm. Carolyn's worst nightmare appeared to have come true.
The detectives go back to the property and they see a fire, and it's personal items being burned, it's clothing, it's other items, but one thing that stands out to them is they believe that they see bones.
And they appeared to be human bones, specifically a toe. It was the key mistake in the timeline of the case against Sheila Labarre.
They also found Kenny's sneakers lying around. Would he really have left barefoot?
The evidence was everywhere that something truly horrific had happened at the farm, but Sheila Labarre showed no fear of being caught. She'd made no attempt to hide what she was doing. She berated police for daring to trespass on her land, brazenly joked about the horrifying finds that they'd made.
When asked what was burning in the barrel, she said it could be a rabbit or it could be a pedophile. When asked about a plastic bag filled with soot and debris, she laughed and said that was Kenneth.
When police returned with a warrant to search the property, they made even more horrifying finds. There was no doubt multiple acts of extreme violence had been committed.
They spray what's called LCV. It's a type of spray that it's with dark lights, and when you spray this, if it glows purple and a purple tone to it, it indicates the presence of blood, that perhaps that was blood. And when the detectives used this technique inside of Sheila's home, the whole inside, this one room, lit up purple. An indication that there was an extremely large amount of violence that took place inside that room.
Detectives also finally had an answer to the fate of Michael Deloge, who disappeared without a trace a year before.
One of the things they did was they flushed the septic tank. What they found in the septic tank when they searched it was Michael Deloge's driver's license.
But another piece of evidence unearthed at the farm remains a mystery to this day.
We don't know how many victims that are out there that Sheila actually was able to suck into her web. What still haunts the detectives is a toe, a single toe. A single toe was found on that property. That toe is unidentified.
One of the things later about the human toes was that they didn't belong to Kenny, and they didn't belong to Michael Deloge. So who is it?
Detectives now knew that terrible things had happened at the isolated horse farm in rural New Hampshire, and Kenneth Countie knew that her efforts to save her eldest son had been in vain.
That was my son. That was my son. Could have been stopped.
Finally, one mistake having been uncovered and other evidence now plentiful, a warrant was issued for Sheila Labarre's arrest. But still, she thought she was above the law. From under the noses of local police, she went on the run.
Sheila took $85,000 with her and hitched a ride with a man called Steve Martello.
She wanted to hitchhike her way down to Boston. So Steve picks her up in his car, and after having some breakfast together, they continue down to Boston. And she gets a hotel room with him, and the two of them have sex, and then he leaves. And it isn't until he sees the news that Sheila is a wanted woman that he realizes who he had picked up.
She seduced him, and he let her hole up in his apartment for a couple days.
He realizes who he has let into his home, and he calls the police and essentially sets up her capture.
Sheila Labarre was behind bars at last. When the case went to trial, Sheila finally admitted killing Kenneth Countie and Michael Deloge, but asked for clemency on the grounds of insanity.
She changed her story several times about how her victims had died. She kept going back again and again to that same story that she was an avenging angel sent to kill pedophiles, and that all of the men in her life were child molesters.
The jury rejected Sheila's plea. There was too much evidence of calculation, control, manipulation, not only of her victims, but of everybody that she came into contact with.
And the burden is on the defense, in this case Sheila, that they didn't know what they did was wrong. Why this story would unravel with Sheila is because of the amount of planning that went into her murders and the cover-up. Somebody who's crazy isn't going to try to burn evidence. Somebody who's crazy isn't going to try to cover up the amount of blood that was inside the house. Somebody who is crazy isn't going to methodically pick the most vulnerable of victims.
Sheila Labarre is a disturbed person, but she knew what she was doing when she killed those men and when she hid the evidence.
Michael Deloge's mother was in court to see Labarre found guilty, sentenced to 2 life tariffs without parole. Carolyn Countie was there too, the mother who never gave up. She wasn't able to save her son, but she did ensure that his killer was brought to justice for her evil crimes.
I promised Kenny that I'd fight for him, because nobody did. That he wouldn't be forgotten. When Sheila murdered him, she burnt everything in the pit. I never had a body. I never had closure. I never had anything. So he could walk through that door now, and I'd be expecting him. And I promised him his name would not be in vain. She wasn't used to being confronted by anybody. Sheila had the run of Epping. What Sheila said went. She'd be able to say anything to the police. They didn't want to deal with her, so they just backed down.
Sheila thought that she was invincible. She thought that she could do what she wanted and get away with it, and she never thought that anyone would have the guts to confront her.
Sheila Labarre was so brash that she didn't cover her tracks, as she left a human bone sticking out of a burning barrel in her yard. It gave the police the opportunity they'd been waiting for to finally investigate her crimes. That was the mistake made by a killer, Sheila Labarre. An allotment in North London. Police are searching for a missing woman.
They gain entry to the allotments, and whilst they're looking for her, they're calling her phone.
They're making their way to her plot. They're still ringing her number, and they hear the sound of a phone ringing.
They hear it coming from a locked shed.
There's a padlock on the door. Inside, they will find the body of 80-year-old Lea Adri-Soejoko. She's been murdered.
When they broke into the shed, they found the terrible sight of Lea dead within there. She was wearing Wellington boots, she had an apron on, and unfortunately a cord round her neck. She was also found to have a set of the keys to that particular shed in her pocket.
The suspect list was a small one, and as police investigated, the family of Lea Adri-Soejoko came to realise their mother had been murdered by a friend. It added to their devastation.
A lot of people said they can't imagine what a family like this goes through, and I always said, don't try. In the end, it's the worst thing in the world to lose anyone to violence. It will completely turn your world inside out.
Who was responsible for murder on the allotment? Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Rahim Mohammadi as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake? Set within the neat rows of houses of an area of North London known as Colindale is a much prized parcel of land, divided carefully into rows. And each of those rows is tended lovingly by someone who has rights to grow plants and flowers in a corner of the capital of England over which they retain control. One such person was Lea Adri-Soejoko.
Lea Adri-Soejoko was a very fit and healthy lady in her early 80s. She was and had been for many years the secretary of the Colindale allotment. Her home, which she had occupied for about 40 years by the time she died, was but 150 metres from the main entrance to the allotment.
She had made London her home and her hobby the allotment, two factors which would contribute to her murder. One solved because of a key mistake made by a killer, and it was because of a key.
It was very strange that she was inside the shed, but the shed door was locked, and that reduced the amount of suspects really that the police were interested in talking to, because there were only a certain number of keys. Now, Lea had hers on her. There were a couple of other keys that were either broken, unusable, people were out of the country.
An allotment is a peculiarly British thing, a place to garden and grow if you don't have a space of your own, or if yours is too small.
She really liked it there. She liked being able to grow her own food. She liked having something to go to do. She liked, I think, meeting the people there. And then when she started, I think, when she joined the committee and they asked her to do that, she enjoyed that. She enjoyed meeting all the different people.
Colindale is a residential suburb on the northern edge of London that enjoys a great deal of cultural diversity. Lea herself had moved from overseas and made North London her home. Lea's son Mark recalls how much she relished welcoming new faces to the allotment.
After she retired, she liked basically being busy, having something to do, having something that basically made things better for, not just for her, but for, for other people, enabling people to use the allotments and, helping organise all of that. She really enjoyed it.
Lea knew what it was like to have to find your feet in an unfamiliar place.
My mum was from Belgium. She was born, I think, in Antwerp in 1936.
In the early 60s, whilst training to be a bookkeeper, she met and fell in love with the man who was to become her husband.
They got married in 1965, and then, I think in early 1966, they moved to London. Dad's job moved him to London and they came over and they stayed in London ever since.
Lea and her husband Antonius quickly found their feet in the UK. They settled in North London, had 3 children. Lea's house in Colindale had a garden that she loved to tend. It was that which ignited a passion for gardening that led her to getting an allotment. There, she soon became a familiar face.
Well, there was the garden at home, which she used to do a lot of the work in. You know, Dad would mow the lawn, she would work in the flower bed. She liked cooking, so she liked to have vegetables and she liked to grow those. So there would be tomato plants around and stuff like that.
John Price is the barrister who would one day be charged with prosecuting the man who took the life of Lea Adri-Soejoko.
She was well known to all of the plot holders. She'd been the secretary of it for many, many years, and she was much loved by them all.
They all really loved her. She didn't take sides. She was there trying to make sure that everybody was able to enjoy the allotments as much as possible.
One of those allotment holders was Rahim Mohammaddi, and from the moment that he arrived in Colindale, he would benefit from Lea's acceptance and kindness. His was a tortured life story, literally.
Rahim Mohammadi was a refugee from Iran. His origins were in the Kurdish community in Iran.
Rahim Mohammadi was a man who had multiple problems. He said that those problems came from the torture that he had suffered in Iran, and he did have lots of scarring on his body. He seemed to have lots of medical problems and suffered quite badly with back pain.
And he came over to the UK in 2005 where he sought asylum. The basis of his claim was that he'd been subject to torture, and he carried some significant injuries. He had a glass eye.
On the face of it, a vulnerable-looking man who had lots of problems.
A charity called Freedom from Torture nurtured relationships with allotments across the country. What better way to help refugees escaping abuse than to offer them a piece of land of their own to cultivate?
It was a charity that helped people who had experienced torture or had escaped really cruel regimes.
He was introduced by a charity to the allotment really as therapy to help him deal with the effects of what had happened to him in Iran.
A refugee, a victim of torture, debilitated by his injuries, a fish out of water in a new country. Rahim had struggled to find his place in the busy hustle and bustle of London. But when he started visiting Colindale allotments, it was as though he'd found his niche. As well as attending as part of therapy sessions, he soon began visiting on his own. And despite the fact that there was a 7-year waiting list for a plot, Rahim Mohammadi was able to get one of his own, and quickly.
There came a time in 2013 when he acquired his own plot. He lived alone. He had a bedsit in Hackney, and he used to travel to the allotment on public transport pretty much every day. It was quite obvious that by the early part of 2017, it was the centre of his life.
In busy London, the allotment was an oasis of calm for a refugee like Mohammadi, a place of friendship for the man who'd suffered torture. Lea Adri-Soejoko looked out for him. A local journalist, Rhys Handley, spoke to others on the allotment who knew her.
She sort of took this very traumatised and very troubled man under her wing.
And at first, Rahim Mohammadi responded by blossoming into a friend and enthusiastic fellow allotmenteer. How could Lea possibly know that a picture was building? Not one framed by flowers and allotment goings-on, but of the killer she had allowed into her life. It was the common bond of gaining purpose from toiling on the Colindale allotment in North London which established a friendship between committee member Lea and the troubled refugee Rahim. A bond which would from time to time be tested by Mr. Mohammadi's occasional flashes of temper. Despite that, she looked for the good in him.
She knew that people were difficult. you know, and, you know, they had issues and they weren't always nice, but she wouldn't hold that against them. She would always try and find something good about them. And I think that's one of the things I think we did learn from her. Sometimes maybe she was a little too trusting.
For many years, it was apparent that the relationship between them was a good one. There is no reason to think that, as with everybody else, he became very fond of her, not least because she was extremely good to him. She indulged him.
Over-indulged him, perhaps. She invited him to her home every now and again for a cup of tea and a chat.
She did things to try and help him. She worked with him. You know, I think he did the odd job around the garden, at house, cutting things back.
Lea involved Rahim in the running and the administration of the allotment. He was handy with machines, so he helped maintain equipment, and he mowed the communal paths. As time went on, he craved even greater involvement and more control over how the allotments were run, and he was to get that control.
He became more and more involved in the running of it. He became active, he was growing fruit, he was growing veg. He'd been invited on to help with the committee by Lea Adri-Soejoko. He became an active member of the committee and seemed to take a great deal of delight in being part of it.
She welcomed into the allotments and sort of opened up these positions for him on the committee for the Colindale allotments.
Getting a place on the allotment committee to a troubled, lonely asylum seeker seems to have been a tremendous achievement. He had become one of the central figures in an organisation that he'd come to love in his new home. He was given keys to the communal buildings, a rare honour. This was a proud moment. He had been accepted. Rahim's horrific past, which had left him maimed for life, was over. But getting a key to an allotment shed would also signal the start of a murder story, because this small amount of power, the power to unlock a communal shed, would decidedly go to Rahim's head. The allotment became his second home. Each time he travelled by bus and tube to get there.
It occupied nearly all of his time, and he was very heavily involved in the politics of the allotment, and he came to have strong views about how it should be managed.
There were a couple of disputes over just the general running of the allotment, just sort of stuff that sounds like quite sort of tedious and busybodyish, maybe even a little bit petty and that kind of thing. But obviously, when you live in a community like this, those things are so important to you, and something like an allotment is a very personal thing for a lot of people. So obviously, Lea took a lot of pride in what she was doing here, and I imagine Rahim probably felt very precious about it as well.
On Rahim Mohammadi getting the keys to the Colindale allotment communal shed, his fellow gardeners discovered they had sown seeds of discontent as one by one he would pick arguments with his allotment neighbours. Lea Adri-Soejoko was often called on to settle disputes. At first, she kept the stressful encounters with Rahim Mohammadi from her family.
She wasn't going to try and make me worry. She didn't want to burden me with stuff, and she was kind of, you know, she managed her business. She would get on and manage her business, and she wouldn't burden other people with it. She wouldn't lay it on any of us, her children.
Lea suffered in silence, but like an unwanted weed, Rahim Mohammadi soon proved difficult to work around or to get rid of. As soon as he achieved his ambition of joining the committee at Colindale, newfound power in a new land started to go to his head. He didn't like the way that Lea ran the allotment, and he wasn't afraid to make his feelings clear.
Just after Mohammadi had joined the management committee, things started to change. He started to change. He became quite upset about the way that he saw that Lea was running things.
There was increasing tension between him and Lea Adri-Soejoko because he found himself increasingly frustrated by the way in which she managed the allotment. And whereas he would have had her be much harsher on what he saw as infractions of the rules by other plot holders, he only ever found her looking for a way to resolve disputes, to diplomatically deal with incidents, and to try and find a way of resolving problems without causing conflict.
She did not impose what she wanted on other people. She would not impose on people at all, that kind of way.
Mohammadi was a stickler for the rules. When other gardeners did things he didn't think were right, holding noisy parties on their plot, building fences above regulation height, he demanded that the committee come down hard on them. In meetings, he was becoming increasingly vocal about the way things should be done. That wasn't Lea Adri-Soejoko's style. She believed the allotments were there for everybody to enjoy, and she stuck to her guns.
She wouldn't take nonsense, particularly, and she wouldn't, let's say, let people steamroller her. She wasn't a pushover. At the same time, though, she would never roll over somebody else. She knew what she wanted, and she knew what she would stand up for and what she would need it, and she would make sure she got it, but she would do it in a way that didn't hurt other people.
Things came dramatically to a head one night at one of the committee's regular meetings. An allotment holder had started keeping chickens and rabbits in his shed. That was against the association's rules. Lea favoured a diplomatic approach. Mohammadi insisted angrily that the man must be evicted.
There seemed to have been some very cross words exchanged at a committee meeting where he was quite abusive to her in a fairly open forum.
Her family were becoming concerned.
Don't get too engaged with this guy. Don't get involved beyond what you have to do the stuff for the allotments. You know, be polite, you know, but don't get involved. Don't bring him in any more than you need to.
But Lea was not about to allow herself to be bullied.
He was venturing his view on the matter, and there came a moment when she told him to shut up. And this, according to the other committee members, greatly angered him. He was described as being extremely cross. He appeared very offended at having been told by her to shut up.
He shouted insults back at her in front of everybody else. I mean, he called her an old witch, you know, among other things. And it was really quite nasty and very, very awkward for everybody.
What he said may have been much worse, but his precise words were soon to be in dispute. Lea and her fellow gardeners were horrified that things had got so out of hand. They hadn't really seen this side of Mohammadi before. He'd always been passionate, but now he seemed dangerous, unpredictable.
He had to be pacified. He accepted that there'd been an incident which he regretted and which should not have occurred.
Shocked and upset, Lea immediately tried to make amends. But after that violent altercation, things were never the same again between the elderly woman and her one-time friend and protege.
After that argument, Lea probably felt a bit bad because she went to Mohammadi and she apologised and she tried to make things right between them. But Mohammadi really did not respond in a way I think that she expected.
Lea had offered an olive branch to him and tried to be a bit of a peacemaker and make things all good again.
To no avail, as emails would later establish.
A number of emails which she'd clearly printed off, and therefore it clearly had had an effect on her, which he had sent to her in the immediate aftermath of this meeting, in which again he had spoken to her over a period of days in those emails in really quite aggressive, unpleasant and intemperate terms.
Did he up the ante? He was sending abusive emails, he was being really rude about her, saying he could run the allotments better and criticising her handling of the finances.
Unsettled, scared even by Mohammadi's behaviour, Lea requested that a note be made in the committee's files of Mohammadi's aggressive outburst. He responded by suggesting to the rest of the committee that Lea was abusing the Allotment Association's finances, something which was an outright lie. Rahim Mohammadi was clearly determined to assert dominance and control over the situation, any way he could. Lea responded by taking a step back from their earlier established friendship.
She was, a bit wary of him in trying to, basically distancing herself slightly in terms of, okay, she would work with him for stuff in the allotment and, but not get involved with anything personally.
she continued to try and treat him with the consideration and the fairness that she had always done. But I think whereas in the past he was a frequent visitor to her home, that would not have caused her a problem. I think such closeness between the two of them was not so welcome.
More than unwelcome, Lea told close family members she was becoming frightened.
From things that she had subsequently said to her granddaughter and to her daughter about what was taking place, that she was, to use their phrases, that she was increasingly wary of him. And having seen what he'd done at the meeting in the presence of others, and having seen the emails that he was prepared to send to her as a way of trying to coerce her into doing what he wanted her to do, she was ever more unsettled by his behaviour and, as they said, ever more wary of him.
Though Lea was now on her guard around Rahim Mohammadi, she had no way of knowing just how much danger she was in, despite a stream of angry emails.
No one seemed to have the impression that she could provoke someone to do something like this, and obviously no one deserves to have something like that happen to them, but with Lea it was an especial shock because she was known as a decent and upstanding person.
As shocked as she and others were, nobody could possibly know how far Rahim Mohammadi was prepared to take his anger. Lea Adri-Soejoko was in grave danger, down on the allotment. The 27th of February 2017 was a day like any other for Lea Adri-Soejoko and Rahim Mohammadi. He planned to travel across London to spend most of the day at the allotment. She would spend the morning at home before walking over to her plot, just meters from her house on Colindale Lane.
It was a date in late February. It was a wet and miserable day. There were very few people on the allotment.
Lea was seen heading to the allotment site just after 2:30 in the afternoon by a former plot holder.
She had been due to meet a very good friend of hers to go to a meeting of the Harrow and Wealdstone Allotment Society, and it was going to involve a journey by her from Colindale tube station and then taking a bus to arrive at the venue at about 7:30 that evening. And she'd arranged to meet her friend shortly before that near the bus stop where she was due to disembark.
The meeting had been set up via phone calls.
He was the last person that she ever spoke to, and they'd confirmed that arrangement.
Lea has an appointment to go and meet a friend, but she doesn't make that appointment, and the friend is really quite worried and raises the alarm, wondering where she is.
He had then called her starting at just after 6 o'clock, and his calls to her went to voicemail. And he called her about 3 or 4 times between 6 and 6:20, and each of the calls went to voicemail.
Lea Adri-Soejoko was someone who kept her appointments. She wouldn't have left her friend waiting without calling him to explain why.
She was always mindful of what others needed and what they wanted, and she would not, let's say, ignore their needs or just brush them aside. She wouldn't do that.
And when she didn't turn up, he went back to the house at which her granddaughter lived, and so it became known to the family that she hadn't kept this appointment.
So after searching fruitlessly for Lea for a number of hours, they decided to call the police.
They took themselves to Colindale police station, reported her missing. Because of her age, the police immediately treated this as an urgent case. She was treated as a vulnerable person.
Lea had never disappeared before. She'd always answered her phone. She was always careful not to give her children and grandchildren any cause for concern. Scared, confused, Lea's family worried that she'd been taken ill, perhaps fallen badly, and was lying in the dark in need of urgent help. Her daughter went looking for her.
The police assisted her with a search and in the early hours of the morning, and they went to the allotment just to search the general allotment area.
They're making their way to her plot. They're still ringing her number, and they hear the sound of a phone ringing. They realised that that might be hers because obviously it coincided with them using their phone, so they followed that sound, ringing the number again, and it took them to the mower shed. The phone could clearly be heard coming from within the shed.
How had her mobile phone come to be in there? Neither the family nor the police had a key for the lock. It was too urgent to wait. Officers set about forcing open the door. What they found inside was the stuff of nightmares.
When they get inside, they see Lea's body lying there.
She was wearing Wellington boots, she had an apron on, and unfortunately a cord round her neck.
Lea Adri-Soejoko was dead. She was wearing her gardening clothes, old trousers and an apron. Her head and face were covered with an old coat. Underneath the coat, they found her face was badly bruised. A lawnmower cord wrapped around her neck. When police examined Lea more closely, they discovered something that would prove to be pivotal in their investigation. The killer's mistake, which would lead them very quickly to the door of a murderer.
It was very strange that she was inside the shed, but the shed door was locked.
The padlock on the mower shed was one which required the use of its key not merely to unlock it, but to lock it.
And when searching her, they found the keys to the lock shed in her pocket.
Her padlock key was on her allotment key ring in the pocket of the jacket that she was wearing inside the shed.
And that reduced the amount of suspects, really, that the police were interested in talking to, because there were only a certain number of keys. Now, Lea had hers on her.
They would have also then been thinking about who else has a key and who could possibly have locked that shed with Lea dead inside.
The killer could not have used Lea's key to lock the lawnmower shed. He or she must have had their own to relock the shed when leaving. Apart from Lea, only 4 other people held those keys. Who had locked Lea in that shed, and who had killed her? Colindale allotments became a crime scene, and the investigation that followed would send shockwaves through a residential neighbourhood.
It was a bit of a shock for the local community, I think, for it to happen. And everyone was just a little bit desperate to know what was going on. Everyone was concerned for their safety and that kind of thing.
People don't get killed on allotments, except somebody had been killed. In a corner of North London, a real-life murder mystery had begun.
Colindale is quiet, Colindale's unassuming, it's diverse but it's vibrant. It's got community things like the allotment going on, and often most of my coverage was related to community things, village fairs and you know, children dressing up for book day and that kind of thing. It was a little bit of a shock to see it come through on the newswire and to get tip-offs from residents saying that Colindale was where a potential murder had happened.
The Metropolitan Police's major investigations team was called to the scene. The local journalist Rhys Handley had never seen activity like this in Colindale.
When I got here, there was already a cordon put up. It was quite hard to get close. I couldn't get even as near as this when I was here last time.
Once the site was sealed off, detectives set about finding out who had keys to the lawnmower shed where Lea's body had been found. Apart from Lea, there were 4 others to track down. Officers soon learned one of them was Rahim Mohammadi. It meant he was a person of interest. As well as his status as a key holder putting him in the frame, his behaviour on the day of the murder was arousing serious suspicion. On being confronted by a police cordon when he arrived at the allotment that morning, Mohammadi showed no curiosity about why he couldn't enter. He simply walked away.
He made no inquiry of the police on the gates as to why they were there, but much more significantly, he didn't ring her up to say, Lea, what's going on at the allotment? Why is it closed? And of course, she only lived 150 yards from the gate. He didn't pop round to the house to see what the problem was.
Why? Because he already knew exactly what had happened. As police began to make their inquiries, a post-mortem was carried out on Lea's body.
She was strangled using the starter cord of the disused allotment lawnmower in the lawnmower shed. She was badly beaten up. she had sustained a number of recent blunt force impacts which had caused, amongst other things, fractured ribs, serious bruising to her face, including around her mouth, and there was a minor fracture to one of the vertebrae at the back of her neck.
Whoever had killed her had to be able to access the shed that her body was found in. Was not realizing how few people had a key, the mistake which would cost Rahim Mohammadi a lifelong prison sentence. There had been an extraordinarily violent attack on an 80-year-old woman. What on earth could have caused aggression of such magnitude, especially against somebody who was well-liked, who'd never hurt so much as a fly in her life? Reporters were hearing all about Lea Adri-Soejoko.
From what I know from the people that I spoke to, she was a lovely woman. She was unassuming, but she was also very dignified. She was very generous, and she was very open and decent. She was happy to lend a hand to anyone who asked.
For her children and grandchildren, a tragedy which bordered on the absurd.
If you read about it, or you saw it as something in a drama, you think, no, that's just stupid. And it is. It's such a stupid, wasteful, wicked act. It made no sense at all. It's utterly senseless, and it is so ridiculous. Mum wouldn't hurt a person, hurt anything or anyone.
While Lea's family and friends reeled from the shock of her murder, police followed the trail of the keys.
There were a couple of other keys that were either broken, unusable, people were out of the country.
The inquiry would have looked hard at who had access to that shed and where exactly all the keys and the key holders would have been. They found that one of the key holders was currently on holiday in Peru. Another had left the allotment at 9 o'clock in the morning, and they could, I think, quite easily demonstrate that. And that the other key was entirely bent out of shape and wouldn't have worked in the lock. So that only left Mohammadi.
Rahim Mohammadi had been proud to become a member of the allotment committee. It had been a mark of status, acceptance, when he was handed his set of keys. Now they were bringing suspicion to his door, so he had to answer for his movements.
From the very start, although admitting that he was present on the allotment that afternoon, denied that he had any involvement in her death at all.
He gave inconsistent accounts of his movements around the time. He did claim that he'd been to see Lea in order to return a tape measure. He did say he'd been to the allotment that day, and he did talk about hearing a drunken fight, but just discounted it as nothing.
He said he'd been gardening for most of the day. He claimed he'd only left the site once to visit the shops on the nearby Edgware Road, and that he had seen nothing untoward at the allotment before returning home. But, piece by piece, detectives were gathering evidence that exposed his lies.
In line with nearly all murder inquiries, CCTV plays an enormous part. And extensive CCTV inquiries in the local area close by the allotment showed him active at the times when she'd last been seen.
CCTV on the Edgware Road captured this defendant going to and from that shopping area on 3 separate occasions.
When asked why he had been along the road so often and hadn't volunteered the information earlier, Mohammadi admitted something to the police that they had not expected. He said he needed drugs.
He introduced into the case the fact that he had an opium habit and that he was supplied with opium by another plot holder. And of course, that enabled him also to explain why he had not revealed that he'd been down there 3 times, because he said he didn't want to tell the police that he'd been buying opium.
Detectives never got to the bottom of Mohammadi's lies about his movements that day, why he tried to hide his comings and goings from the allotments, but they suspected it was tied up with Lea's murder. And as their inquiries progressed, they found even more damning evidence against him. DNA on the cord used to strangle Lea.
It was accepted that the DNA found on the cord that matched his profile was indeed his. But it was his case that the obvious explanation for that was as a result of him, in fact, having replaced the cord several years ago when it needed to be done.
Rahim Mohammadi continued to deny his guilt. But the police were building an ever clearer narrative of what had happened at Colindale allotments on the evening that Lea had died. Both had gone to the site to tend to their plots, but at some point their paths crossed. They rowed in one shed before tragic events played out in another.
There was an encounter between the two of them in the committee shed next door, much as had happened in that same building 6 months earlier. There had occurred a row of some sort, but this time there was nothing to inhibit him because there was no one else there. And he lost it, and he hit her.
There was clearly a violent altercation. Lea was violently assaulted.
So there was a hot-blooded assault, and then suddenly this man, whose life was the allotment, was faced with a lady, possibly partly conscious or unconscious at his feet, whom he'd hit, and of course who knew who had done this to her. And our case was that he knew that his days on the allotment were finished if she was allowed to identify him as being the person who had done this to her.
At that moment, Rahim Mohammadi had a choice to make. He could have sought help for Lea, called an ambulance, but if he had done that, she would have reported the attack. He stood to lose everything. He'd be booted off the allotment. He might face jail. The refugee might even be deported.
He took the decision, there's no other way of putting it, he took the decision that she had to die.
To complete the murder, Mohammadi felt that he had to move to the allotment shed to which he had a key so very few people had.
He unlocked the shed next door, he picked her up, he took her in there, he laid her out, and then he applied the cord to her neck to kill her in order to prevent her from reporting the fact that he had beaten her up. It was a cold-blooded killing carried out to cover up a hot-blooded assault.
Rahim Mohammadi covered Lea Adri-Soejoko's face with an old coat, left the shed, locking the heavy padlock with his own key. Though he didn't know it, it was at that moment that he secured his own conviction. What did he plan to do next? Was he going to return to the shed in the dead of night and move her body? The next part of his plan never became clear, because even when charged with murder and faced with all of the evidence, Mohammadi refused to admit his guilt, to tell the full story.
Mr. Mohammadi protested his innocence before the trial, during the trial. He protested his innocence to the jury after he'd been sentenced. As far as I am aware, he protests his innocence still.
Some found it hard to believe that Mohammadi was a killer.
He called witnesses as part of his case, and there was a particular individual who worked for the charity that had placed Mr. Mohammadi on the allotment all those years ago, who was still a supporter of his, came to give evidence for him. And it was quite apparent from the way in which that gentleman gave his evidence that he genuinely found it very difficult to believe that Mr. Mohammadi could have been responsible for so appalling and serious an act of violence.
But he was responsible, despite his denials.
He displayed a level of cunning and care in what he had to say, and he thought very carefully about how he might best explain the evidence that was relied upon against him. He was vehement, he protested loudly, he answered questions at great length. In his summing up, the judge was prompted to ask rhetorically of the jury, depending upon their view of the matter, whether a stage had been reached whereby Mr. Mohammadi had convinced himself that he had not done it.
His protestations fell on deaf ears. The strength of the evidence stacked up against him was just too strong. On November 30th, 2018, Rahim Mohammadi was found guilty of the murder of Lea Adri-Soejoko and sentenced to life in prison. He was told he would serve at least 19 years before he could be considered for release. As he was sent down, Mohammadi told the judge and the jury they were jailing an innocent man.
I think either he has convinced himself he didn't do it, or he's disassociated from it somehow. So it's not real. He actually, I think the only thing that came close to, from what I can understand, of him showing any kind of remorse is the fact that he covered her face. When her face was covered with an old coat when she was laid out. But other than that, I don't think he has shown any remorse or any acceptance of what he's done.
It was a most remarkable case. She was a remarkable and much-loved woman who did a great deal for many people who lived, worked and spent time on that allotment. The conduct of the case was very difficult. It was almost a throwback. This was, in many senses, an old-fashioned case in which the prosecution had to rely on a combination of circumstances to explain a story and to prove a man's guilt. And there are not many cases like that anymore.
The key piece of evidence was the key itself to the lawnmower shed where Mohammadi had left Lea's body after he had killed her. Being the only key holder without an alibi that afternoon was the one piece of evidence he simply could not explain away.
Clearly, the biggest mistake that Mohammadi made, he made a few, but the biggest mistake was locking that shed door. I think he locked that shed door because he didn't want anybody to find Lea before he'd had a chance to clean up or do whatever he was going to do. But it was that was his undoing.
Locking the shed with his own key placed Rahim Mohammadi firmly on the scene when Lea Adri-Soejoko was murdered. That was his killer's mistake, the reason he's been sentenced to life in prison. The guilty verdict, however, is not a consolation for the family of Lea Adri-Soejoko.
While we believe the right person has been found guilty, it's not something to feel good about at all, It's not about triumph or anything like that. It doesn't bring Mum back. A lot of people said that there'd be justice for her. If there was actually justice, it would never have happened.
A wooded area behind a strip mall in Connecticut. A McDonald's nearby, two places known all too well to William Devon Howell. It was where he stopped in his van when working in neighborhoods nearby.
He called it the murder mobile. He called that field, that area where those bodies were buried, his garden.
He's a monster. Sick.
Howell abducted his victims in plain sight. He raped and killed them in a busy car park, and then dumped their bodies just meters from where people went about their daily business.
He would drive around with his victims tied up in the back of his van for 12 hours before he would park, strangle them, and then bury them in the woods.
William Devon Howell went through his murder routine 7 times in 9 months.
He felt like if he raped and murdered one woman and got caught for it, he would get death. So why not go on and rape and murder as many as possible?
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal William Devon Howell as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake? In 2003, 7 women went missing from an area of Connecticut off the Berlin Turnpike, a road once known as Gasoline Alley near New Britain. One of them was Lea Adri-Soejoko, reported missing on July the 31st. She had last been seen 6 days earlier after leaving this motel, where she was living with her boyfriend Angel Sanchez, known as Ace.
Lea would stay here, and in the afternoons, she and Ace would walk along the Berlin Turnpike after they left the motel and arrive at the inner city section of New Britain, where Lea would prostitute and Ace would purchase their drugs. At the end of their evenings, they would walk all the way back to the Almar Motel.
On the day of her disappearance, Lea and Angel went to a grocery store car park.
They're there to purchase drugs. The boyfriend says that Lea was there to meet her connection, the one that she bought drugs from. And Lea gets in this van, and she's never heard from again.
It was Lea's sister who reported the 33-year-old woman missing to police. The finger of suspicion for Lea's disappearance immediately pointed towards Ace.
One of the suspects, of course, was Ace Sanchez. Detective Derone wondered if perhaps it was a domestic violence incident. These two had been known to have a rough and tumble relationship and get physical with one another and have verbal altercations. So it wasn't outside of the realm of possibility that maybe Ace Sanchez was responsible for the disappearance of Lea Adri-Soejoko.
The police brought him in for questioning, but he passed a polygraph test, insisting that he had nothing to do with his girlfriend's disappearance. Instead, he named William Howell as the man Lea was last seen with.
And he describes a blue van. He describes the figure, the same kind of body shape and style of that of Howell.
Lea and Ace already knew Howell. He would sometimes give them lifts up and down the turnpike in his van. He also would party with them in their motel room. They smoked crack together, they smoked weed, they sometimes drank together.
William Howell was a gardener and odd job man tending homes and gardens in the affluent tree-lined streets of New Britain. Heavy-set at 5'9" and 220 pounds, with long, dirty blonde hair, he had his middle name tattooed on his bicep. He kept the tools of his trade in his beaten-up black and blue Ford van. It had 2 broken windows that were covered with plywood. It was also where he sometimes slept, and where he took prostitutes that he picked up off the Berlin Turnpike. The road was the place to go to pick up sex workers, and that's what he liked to do.
He drove around in a van and he cut people's yards. It is yet again a story of a killer who blended in, who did not stand out. He wasn't unique. He would be somebody that would be very commonplace to see in anybody's neighborhood.
Howell would admit that he had given Lea a ride, but told the authorities that he let her out further down the road and she walked away. Detectives were not convinced. Suspicious, they decided to trace the van, which led them to the owner, Dorothy Holcomb.
The police first went to Dorothy Holcomb's house, and she was also Howell's girlfriend. Dorothy said he wasn't home. Even though police could see the figure of a man, a big man, through the curtains, and that he almost never drove the van, that in fact another male friend, drove the van.
Detectives then decided to forensically analyze the van.
Despite the efforts to clean that van, there's one small piece of evidence, and that is blood. Indeed, it's the victim's blood inside the van, and she's the last one seen with him, and you now have an identification. And so what you would have now is a very good circumstantial case.
But Howell refused to admit what he'd done to Lea. He claimed she and her boyfriend Ace had fought in the back of his van, and Ace had hit her and spilled her blood in the van. Police didn't believe him. Howell's trial for murder was looming. Believing that detectives had a strong case against him, Howell made a pragmatic move.
You can't necessarily prove absolute murder off of one drop of blood in a van, but a reasonable person could come to that conclusion. So with a very circumstantial case, you have William Howell that pleads guilty.
I think what motivated him to accept that plea was the fact that the prosecution had blood DNA evidence on hand showing that Nilsa Arizmendi's blood was in that van. Now granted, it was just a single drop of blood, but they had it. Also at that time, the prosecution had an eyewitness who saw William Devin Howell drive off with Nilsa Arizmendi in his van back in July 2003. He was the last person to be seen with Nilsa Arizmendi.
He pleaded guilty to manslaughter. Without a body, prosecutors were forced to accept his plea. He was sentenced to 15 years, but cops had a nagging suspicion they hadn't uncovered the whole story.
When the investigators searched Howell's van back in 2004 and 2005, they didn't just discover one DNA sample belonging to Nilsa Arizmendi. They also discovered blood belonging to an unknown victim. So at that time, law enforcement knew that there was likely another person that Howell had killed.
But who? No connection was made with the other women reported missing off the Berlin Turnpike.
Often there's the assumption that these people just fell off the radar. Perhaps they overdosed on their drugs, they skipped town, they got in trouble, were sent out of state and incarcerated somewhere else. So not much was being done.
And all of the women were dead, killed at the hands of William Devin Howell. Howell remained in prison on a single conviction for manslaughter and due for release sometime in 2018. He'd evaded capture because of the lifestyle of the missing women. He was a serial killer, but one whose mistakes were as yet unknown to detectives. What sort of person was William Devin Howell in 2003?
Howell was a heavy drinker, and he was also addicted to paying for sex.
Anne Howard, a local attorney, got to know Howell well as she researched what had happened to the women who were reported and officially classified as missing. She lives in a Connecticut home just a few miles from what she would discover were the killing grounds where Howell drove his van.
Howell began to solicit prostitutes at a very young age. He describes for me the first time that he drove to Newport News, and he went to the red light district of this city in Virginia. He was only 14 years old. He stole his father's car in the middle of the night and drove silently off and picked up his first prostitute. After that, he told me it became his secret addiction, soliciting prostitutes in the middle of the night. By the age of 12, William Devin Howell's mother got sick with breast cancer. She was at the time in her early 50s. She was sort of a source of stability in his life. She gave him protection and routine. She was a strong disciplinarian.
Without her in his life, Howell seems to have gone off the rails.
What was out of the ordinary was the extent to which he was drinking throughout his adolescence. He told me that by the time he was in high school, there really wasn't a day when he wasn't drinking alcohol, sometimes in the morning before he went to school. He only kept his driver's license for about a year and a half before he got into a drunk driving accident.
Alongside his drinking, another addiction, sex.
By the time he was in his 30s, Howell estimated that he had slept with over 1,000 prostitutes.
The teenage William paid for his habit any way he could. He had a paper route. He did odd jobs for the neighbors, mowing lawns, sweeping up leaves. He worked as a cashier in a 7-Eleven, anything to scrape together the $20 that he needed for his next fix, his next hookup with a sex worker. His addiction, coupled with the loss of his mother at such a young age, seems to have had a profound effect on the way that he viewed women, even the mother of his children.
I think he had a very strict binary code in his head about the difference between good girls and bad girls. And he has told me that the mother of his children he considered to be a good girl. She did not drink. She did not use drugs. She was a good mother to the children.
And then there were the women that Howell considered bad girls. They were sometimes doing drugs or selling themselves on the street. They were drinking. They were doing dangerous things. And they contrasted with the women in his life that he considered good girls.
It was what Howell would call the bad girls who were officially missing as he lay in prison on a single manslaughter charge. Around that time, Anne Howard became intrigued by the mystery of the missing women, and she made contact with the man she came to know as Bill Howell.
Hey, Bill. Can you hear me okay? Because I'm on speakerphone.
Yeah, I can tell, though. It sounds like an echo.
Okay.
A man who freely admitted to her his disdain for sex workers.
It was their lifestyle. It was their lifestyle and my discontent of it.
And the contempt you felt was because they were selling their bodies on the streets for drugs, right?
Yeah, I felt like they were selling their bodies on the street. They were putting themselves at risk. They probably spread diseases to husbands and boyfriends. And I don't know if disdain is the right word for it or discontent.
During the time that Anne Howard was researching the mystery of the disappearance of women off the Berlin Turnpike, Howell remained unsuspected in their murders. When would detectives make a breakthrough? What mistake had the killer made? Most of those that Bill Howell came into contact with on the outside and inside prison on a daily basis thought he was friendly, genial. His defense attorney, Bill Petzold, certainly got that impression.
He was an affable Southern gentleman, had a good sense of humor, and was very easygoing and laid back. I still try to look at him and say, could he really have done this? I still didn't see him in that context of committing these, vicious crimes.
There was nothing gentle about the way William Devon Howell treated his first victim, Melanie Ruth Camillini, an accomplished pianist in her teenage years from a comfortable Connecticut background, but who fell foul of opioid addiction.
She was strong, beautiful. She was a good mom. She wanted to be better. And she fought to be better. But not strong enough to do that.
Jessica Camillini recalls the moment that Melanie's family realized she was missing. It wasn't unusual for the mother of two to disappear for weeks, sometimes months at a time, but she would check in with her children. This time it was different.
She had a really strong addiction, but she went through phases, and she would be there, and there'd be a few months when she'd be gone. We didn't know where she was. And no matter what, though, she would always reach out to her kids. Always. So, when it came to the point to where she was gone for a year and she didn't talk to her kids, you knew something was wrong. Because even if she was in trouble and couldn't come back in fear of being arrested, she'd reach out to her kids. And she didn't.
Jessica remembers her sister as a big personality who was attracted to the wrong people. In her mid-teens, Melanie's new friends introduced her to drugs. Her family found themselves powerless to help as they watched her personality change.
She wasn't shy. She was bold, strong, daring, crazy. She was. She used to love saying things to get a reaction. Yeah, she was funny. She used to make me laugh.
But then Jessica saw a change in her sister.
I can remember being around 16. She was around 17. I can remember seeing a change and her just changing, getting into trouble. Our room was on the 3rd floor, and then we had a circular staircase down to the 2nd floor, and there was a washer and dryer there, and she would always do a load of laundry late at night, so my parents couldn't hear her sneaking out.
The last time that Jessica saw Melanie was typical of the way Mel's life had become. It isn't a happy memory of her beloved big sister.
I was, I believe, 8 months pregnant with my son. I flew to Connecticut, visiting family, and I went over to her place, and unfortunately, she was passed out on the couch again. I'm not sure what the circumstances were behind it, but I didn't get to talk to her.
It was soon after that Melanie Camellini encountered William Devon Howell.
So Howell describes to me the day in which he decided, it was a very deliberate decision on his part, that he was going to rape his first prostitute. He was going to make the fantasy a reality. He went to the hardware store, and he explains that he was in a state of nervous excitement. He bought the duct tape, the cords, the rip ties, the weapons that he would need to not just carry out the rape of this prostitute, but to kill her as well. He knew that he would have to kill after he raped to conceal the evidence.
Howell picked up Melanie Camellini, took her to a secluded spot, and raped her.
He then tied her to the back bench of the van, kept her in that same location until he could have a cool down period for several hours. During that night, he would off and on rape her and slip into what he would describe as something of a catnap, where he would doze off and then come to again and commit the act all over.
After keeping Melanie Camellini in the back of his van for 12 hours, Howell decided it was time to finish what he'd started.
Now, with respect to the moments before Melanie died, I think that's what is the most heartbreaking, at least for me, to hear firsthand that this woman begged for her life. And William Devon Howell tells me that he hit her on the temple very hard with a hammer with the intention of knocking her out and killing her that way. And he said it didn't even faze her. She put her hand to her head and she said, "Please don't kill me, I have children."
This was a pivotal moment for Howell. He could have let his victim live. He could have ended his killing spree. There's every chance Melanie would have survived the brutal attack that she'd suffered.
She was strong, very strong person, even physically. She was tiny, but still strong.
Howell considered not killing Melanie, but then he realized that he had just spent the last 12 hours raping and torturing her. If he didn't kill her, she would go to the police.
He thought momentarily, maybe I won't kill her. I don't know if I can kill her. But he decided he had to go through with it. And at that point, he strangled her. So then once you killed the first victim, Melanie Camellini, you told me in your words it was game on. Like you felt like I've got nothing left to lose, right?
It was kind of like that. It was, you know, I had crossed that line.
He knew he had nothing left to lose by going on to rape and kill anybody he wanted, because there was a death penalty in the state of Connecticut at that time. He felt like if he raped and murdered one woman and got caught for it, he would get death. So why not go on and rape and murder as many as possible, because ultimately the consequences will be the same.
What Howell did next was perhaps almost as horrifying, as macabre, as the murder that he had just committed.
It was in February, and the ground was frozen. So after strangling Melanie, he tried to bury her in that frozen ground in those woods. He could not do it. And so he had to keep her body in that van for a full 2 weeks.
He describes how he wrapped that body up and slept with a dead body for 2 weeks because it was too cold to bury that body in the ground outside.
He actually dismantled her jaw, and he sliced off her fingertips in a sloppy and frantic attempt to try to remove any traces of this woman's identity after killing her.
He went to the wooded ravine behind the strip mall and put her body in a big plastic barrel. He left it there while he went off to Virginia for several months.
When the weather warmed, he returned to New Britain and buried Melanie's body behind the strip mall.
This grotesque sequence of actions, tying his victims up, raping them, driving around to different locations in his van, killing them, and then dumping their body, would become a well-rehearsed routine for William Devon Howell.
First off, he would stop his van over there behind the strip mall and dump the parcel or the body of his victim wrapped in garbage bags deep into the ravine. And then what he would do is he'd get back into his van and go over to the McDonald's parking lot, park his car, and come back to this location where we're at right now. There's a trail, as you can see. It goes into sort of a meadow-like littered area. And William Devon Howell would walk this trail and make a sharp right that led into the ravine where the parcel that he had left was left in the ravine. He would retrieve a spade, a shovel, that he had stored behind the guardrail, and then he would drag that body along with his shovel about a few hundred yards into the woods to the location that he was known to call his garden, which is where he buried in very shallow graves the 7 bodies of the people that he killed.
Who would be the next to fall to his terrifying compulsion? And what would it take to stop him? Despite the scale of the crimes of William Devon Howell in such a short period in 2003, he was not being investigated. Even as he served time for the manslaughter of one woman whose profile matched those missing, he was not in the frame for their murders. Their bodies had been buried by him here, a 14-acre stretch of woodland behind a busy strip mall. Marilyn Mendez-Gonzalez was one who ended up in what Bill Howell would come to call his garden.
In May of 2003, he was driving through the streets of Waterbury, and he came upon Marilyn Gonzalez. She was also a young mother who had a drug addiction and was turning tricks on the street. As with Camelini and most of his other victims, Howell knew that that night the woman that he paid was going to end up dead. He knew that he would rape Marilyn Gonzalez, and as with all of his other victims, that took place over a 12-hour period. On again, off again, in between rapes, he would bind his captives to the back bench of his van, duct tape their mouths, and drive them to different locations. He never stayed in one location long enough to be seen by anybody. So he would simply drive around and commit 7 or 8 of these rapes and then end it with the strangulation.
Marilyn was just 26 years old. She was the mother of 2 little girls. If she were alive today, she would be a grandmother. But she ended up buried in a shallow grave, yards from a fast food parking lot, where her body would lie undiscovered for over a decade.
Although this strip mall is located on a busy roadway with a busy upscale shopping mall across the street and the strip mall itself with the parking lot to the left, the area to the right is almost inaccessible to the public. The brush gets thicker as you go along.
I remember going to the crime scene, and I walked down the embankment in my dress shoes, and it was kind of muddy and slippery. And when I was down there, I felt like I was in an amphitheater, kind of looking up at the parking lot area, which you couldn't really see the parking lot with the trees that were there. And I thought, this is actually a pretty interesting place to have buried bodies. You know, you'd think, well, people might be driving by and look down, but it wasn't a place that you would suspect.
There are no trespassing signs that line the guardrail and the fencing. There are no walking trails. This isn't a place that anyone would choose to go. Not only that, but when you look at the soil itself, this is really swampy soil. Howell told me that the graves he dug were only about 2 to 3 feet at the most in depth. And that was because the water table out here is so high, and so water would actually start to emerge as he was digging the graves.
After killing his first victims, Howell began snatching sex workers from the street at an alarming rate.
In June 2003, Howell killed his third victim, but this time things went a little differently. Danny Wisnett also went by the name of Janice Roberts. They met outside of a bar after closing time, and she got into his van.
This was a transgender man who was dressed as a woman. He had long, silky black hair, Howell states, and a short mini skirt and high heels. And so, thinking Daniel Wisnett is a female prostitute, he invites Mr. Wisnett into his van. During the transaction that took place, Howell puts his hand on the head of Wisnett and pulls off a wig. He becomes enraged that this man has deceived him into this vulnerable position. He throws Daniel Wisnett against the wall of the van and tells me that he punched him out twice and then quickly strangled him.
Howell later said that he killed Danny to stop him from, quote, duping anyone else. But it also looked like Howell's rage and his addiction to killing was getting even more out of control. He wasn't planning the way he had been before.
Yet still, Howell avoided detection for his crimes.
So this was again a case of society's castaways, society's most vulnerable people, people who others might look at as perhaps not worth the effort, that are cast off. And so nobody notices that they're missing.
In some ways, Howell was hiding in plain sight. During the day, he was driving around in a van. At night, he was using that same van to lure vulnerable women in, to attack them and kill them. Later, he would leave their bodies in fairly public places, quite close to where people were just doing their everyday shopping.
In midsummer 2003, Howell imprisoned, raped, and murdered 2 vulnerable women. The first was Diane Cusack.
She had been addicted to drugs for many years and lived a very hard life on the streets. Howell picked her up in New Britain, Connecticut, and went through his similar routine of raping and strangulation.
Diane was in her early 50s when she died. She had been out of contact with her family for a few years, and no one reported her missing.
After strangling her in the McDonald's parking lot, he buried her behind the strip mall right next door.
The drive-in McDonald's played a big part in Howell's deadly killing spree.
Howell would also go through this very drive-through with some of his victims held captive in the back of his van, tied up and duct taped. And he said to me that he would turn the music up high so no one would hear him or hear the victims if they were screaming or cried for help. And during that time, he would actually order food through the drive-through and ask his victims if they also wanted something to eat, which to me just shows the callousness and the absolute lack of empathy of this man, that as these poor women sat held captive on the back bench, he was ordering food and eating.
Howell was carrying out his crimes in full view of the world, relying on the fact that his victims were never seen by witnesses climbing into his van. He was trusting that no one plying their trade along the turnpike really knew who he was, and that few cared whether or not his victims came back alive. Many did, but that wasn't his calculation. Having already killed 3 women, it was now that he picked up Nilsa Arizmendi. She wanted to buy drugs. Sex was on the agenda.
What happened was, when she refused to finish that transaction, he grew very angry.
When Howell picked up Nilsa Arizmendi, he hadn't been planning on killing her.
He decided in that split second, I am going to rape and kill this woman.
It would be months before he would be arrested in connection with the disappearance of Nilsa, time enough to abduct and murder his 6th and 7th victims.
And the first of those victims in August of 2003 was Mary Jane Menard.
She was in quite a difficult, dark place in her life. She had struggled with alcoholism, but she'd been sober for more than 10 years. She had trained to be a substance abuse counselor so that she could help other people who were going through what she'd been through, but things started to go wrong for her again.
So Mary Jane Menard had back surgery, and at that time she was faced with chronic pain. She was prescribed by her doctors pain medications, and as is the case, unfortunately, with people who struggle with chronic pain, the opioids at some point just weren't enough. And as many find out, they're also very expensive. And so Mary Jane Menard, unfortunately, began to use heroin to help cope with her chronic pain.
She was 40 years old. She went out to buy cigarettes and was never seen again.
He picked up Mary Jane Menard on the streets and went through his typical routine of holding her captive in his van for 12 hours, raping her off and on, and eventually strangling her.
This was also the fate of Joyveline Martinez. Joyveline had been a track star at school before falling victim to drugs. She lived with her mother, who raised the alarm when her daughter failed to show up for her birthday celebrations.
Joyveline Martinez was Howell's last victim. She was a very beautiful young girl. She was only 23 years old at the time of her death. William Devin Howell picked her up on Hillside Avenue in Hartford, Connecticut.
Howell went through what was becoming his usual routine. He kept her captive in his van for 12 hours, then he strangled her and dumped her body.
It was the face of Joyveline Martinez that would one day trigger an extraordinary confession from William Howell, who had killed all of the women, but was in prison for the manslaughter of just one of them. In 2007, the ghosts of all of the people that he had killed were not prepared to lie quietly any longer and began to give up their secrets. In August 2007, as Howell was serving a 15-year stretch, a hunter roaming the woodland off the Berlin Turnpike made a terrifying discovery.
A hunter was walking through the brush with his dog and found what looked like a human bone sticking out of the ground. He called the police, and they began an excavation of the area.
Well, there was a discovery of, I think, as I recall, 3 skeletal remains in that location, but they weren't able to link anything.
The detectives have a hunter who's in a field and he discovers bones. And they get sent off to a lab. And you're waiting. Who do these bones belong to? Where do I begin my investigation on these bones?
It was a eureka moment for the Connecticut detectives, with a long list of missing persons to trace. Or at least it should have been. The crime labs that were tasked with finding out who the bones belonged to made error after error. Years followed before identifications were made.
And you're still wondering. You're waiting for those results, that frustration of the waiting. And you have this dysfunctional lab that hasn't processed the evidence yet.
Not until 2014 would detectives finally be able to break the news to victims' families that their loved ones, 3 of them at least, had been found murdered.
The 3 bodies were named as Diane Cusack, Joyveline Martinez, and Mary Jane Menard. For the families, this was halfway to getting closure, but there was still no one on trial for having killed them.
Police vowed to keep searching the 15-acre woodland. It was a mammoth task. At this stage, they had no idea what linked the 3 women whose bodies that they had already identified, but they were determined to find out if any other victims were buried there. Then, help came from an unexpected quarter, the prison where Bill Howell was incarcerated, and also where a man called Jonathan Mills was serving time.
Almost out of nowhere, you receive information to go speak to an inmate. An inmate has information on this case. And when you go and you interview that inmate, he reveals to those detectives detail after detail. He is able to identify some by their first names of who these victims are. And it is in such a manner that the detectives, it's like switching a light switch on. This inmate is specifically talking about those bones found in that field.
Howell's cellmate came forward to inform on him. He said that they'd been playing cards in their cell, and one of the cards had a picture of a missing woman on it. That woman was Joyveline Martinez.
In an attempt to track down missing people, police put faces of those who had simply disappeared onto the backs of playing cards and distributed them throughout prisons. They were hoping that inmates might recognize faces and volunteer information to the authorities.
The playing cards is a technique that the police and the prosecution have used to try to solve cold cases. And on the back side of the cards are faces of missing, of deceased individuals whose cases are unsolved, and they have their phone number, hotline to call, and a lot of inmates take advantage of that, either because they know or they don't know, but they're going to try to pretend that they know information to try to get their sentences commuted or shortened or something of that sort, some kind of benefit.
Howell saw Joyveline's face and told his cellmate, "I know her, I know where she is."
He starts to tell the story to a cellmate. And as he tells his story, it's almost like a steam engine going down a hill. It gets faster and faster and faster. And he reveals the most intimate details of every crime that only somebody who knew these crimes would be able to tell. What gets William Howell in the end is his braggadocious attitude that he has with his cellmate.
I think the police suspected Bill Howell of being involved in at least some of these unsolved murders, but once Jonathan Mills came forward and disclosed what Bill had told him in confidence during a jail discussion, and Jonathan drew a map. It wasn't a perfect map, but it kind of gave a general sense of where bodies may be located.
And that cellmate was not from that particular area, is able to draw a pretty detailed diagram of where William Howell told them these bodies were buried. And sure enough, behind a supermarket, William Howell's, what he called his garden, was located.
The map wasn't all that Howell's cellmate Jonathan Mills was able to give detectives. Howell had shared some truly disturbing details about his crimes.
He told his cellmate about the time when he drove around with Melanie Camellini's body in his van for 2 weeks and called her his baby.
He refers to his own vehicle. It's not other people that referred to his vehicle as the murder mobile. He called it the murder mobile. He called that field, that area where those bodies were buried, his garden.
He called himself a sick ripper and said that he had a monster inside of him.
He said to Mills that he was going to go back to his bed in his cell that night to dream about his garden and his buried bodies that he had collected in his garden.
Detectives and forensic teams followed the map drawn by Howell's cellmate. One by one, they uncovered 4 more bodies. They were identified as belonging to Nilsa Arizmende, Marilyn Mendez-Gonzalez, Melanie Ruth Camellini, and Danny Lee Wishtant.
And then they were able to really link their DNA, the DNA of the bones that they uncovered, with other evidence that they uncovered from Bill's van.
4 more families were informed that their missing loved ones had been brutally slain, including Melanie Camellini's sister Jessica.
Mom kind of kept me informed with what was going on, and she had called me and said they want to meet with me. So I kind of knew. I knew something was going on. But she said that she would know. Ironically enough, it was on Mel's birthday. Mom said, I'll call you tomorrow after I meet with him. And I remember her calling, and all she said was, "It's her."
You go back and you look at the lives of the victims, you see a face. You see what they look like. It's no longer just a bunch of bones in a field. It's somebody's beautiful daughter, somebody's beautiful sister. And it's all the things that make William Howell the ultimate thief. He stole weddings, he stole futures, he stole celebrations, all from these families. He stole perhaps the hope of redemption and reconciliation that the families were longing for, that they will never get, because William Howell buried those bodies in his garden.
How do you cope? It's horrific. You don't think about it. I don't. Didn't happen. You ask me about my childhood, you ask me about things I did with Mel, it's hard to remember, because I don't want to. Because I don't. You don't want to come to the realization of what really happened. It wasn't a car accident. It wasn't health issues. How do you cope? How do you process?
As the overwhelming evidence stacked up against him, Howell finally admitted his guilt. He was the last person seen with Nilsa Arizmendi. In many ways, that was the mistake he made. Though serving time for her manslaughter only, he had then bragged of his deeds to a fellow convict. His story was finally ready to be told, in full, to Anne Howard, a lawyer and confidant of a man who was Connecticut's worst serial killer.
I guess the saddest part is that even though you're suffering in that isolated cell, you know, at least you have a life. Your victims don't.
Yeah, you know what? People say that, but I might be alive, Ann, but this damn sure ain't living.
Right.
I have a life of being miserable for the rest of my days, and I'd rather be dead than wake up miserable for the rest of my life every day, and that's what I have to serve now.
Yeah, sometimes when you speak like that, it makes me think like you almost felt like you were putting them out of their misery.
I didn't feel like that at the time, but I mean, in a way that, you know, they're out of their misery.
Would Howell have continued to kill if he hadn't been locked up for the death of Nilsa Arizmendi? Even his own attorney struggles when answering that question.
Would this have continued? The answer, I can't answer that for you. But that's certainly a question that looms out there with a lot of people, whether if he had not been apprehended for the Arizmendi murder and received a 15-year jail sentence on that, would this type of behavior have continued? And that's for people to talk about, but nobody really knows.
If he had not, through his own words, damned himself to a lifetime in prison, he may yet still be driving around and be not just Connecticut's most notorious serial killer, but the world's most notorious serial killer.
The more Bill Howell killed, the more mistakes he made. His first was snatching up a woman, Nilsa Arizmendi, whose boyfriend could identify him and his murder-mobile. When he was doing time for her death, he committed his biggest mistake, giving in to a burning urge to brag to his cellmate about the horrific things he had done.
William Howell is in prison. He spills his guts to a cellmate, to a fellow inmate, who is later able to help the detectives in intimate details of what William Howell told him. That's the biggest mistake.
A serial killer was finally unmasked by his mistakes. William Devon Howell was sentenced to 360 years in prison. A man is captured by security cameras buying equipment for what appeared a day in the garden.
He bought the incinerator, which he later used to burn things in the garden. He bought his coveralls, masks and shoe protectors, things like that.
He bought a chainsaw too, but this was no do-it-yourself enthusiast. The man, Thomas Dunkley, was supposedly helping out a boxer that he had hero-worshipped, a fighter who once had legitimate dreams of a world title, but who was left paralyzed and bedridden after a traffic accident. The self-styled governor, Shaun Cummins.
Yeah, it could have been so different for me.
Boxing was his life.
You're making him vulnerable, you're making him dependent. Those are two things that Shaun, the Governor Cummins, had never been.
Shaun Cummins would lose the last fight of his life, murdered by someone who was supposed to be his cornerman.
They phoned me up and just said there'd been a death at the house. They didn't say who it was.
And they also did not reveal how Shaun's body had been found, dismembered.
A body, a human body, is a very unwieldy, heavy, difficult object. And if you can cut it down into pieces, they become more manageable.
The hunt for a murderer soon focused on Thomas Dunkley. If it was him, what would be the mistake to prove he was a cold-blooded killer? It appears incongruous enough buying power tools from a DIY store. But this image from a security camera would change the course of an investigation into the death of Shaun Cummins, a charismatic, powerful and exciting boxer, Shaun Cummins, who'd been quite the star in his hometown of Leicester.
So Shaun has a following, and it's a lively following, and that's because he's a lively character. He's the face. He's the top dog. He's called the Governor.
He's paired with Chris Eubanks, Prince Nazim, in Sheffield and Manchester places, fought a lad called Steve Collins, and he was who won the title and became top 10 in the Pentacontinental Champion. He was a very good boxer. He had punches and combinations of punches that no other boxer used.
In the mid-90s, Shaun's promising career hit the canvas with a series of devastating events. A referee's bad decision snatched European middleweight glory from his grasp. He had floored his opponent, Agostini Cotamoni, with a devastating left hook. There was no way his opponent could beat the 10-second count. Or maybe there was.
Shaun rightfully won the European title that night in San Remo. Cotamoni was given so much time to recover, he managed to see it out to the final bell, and he won a disputed points decision.
I mean, I threw the left hook moving away from Cotamoni, and I didn't deliver it as a knockout punch, and the next thing I know, as I'm stepping away, he's going over. So I slung a right, and unfortunately it missed. But, you know, yeah, it could have been so different for me.
A second heartbreak was to follow. Cummins failed a routine MRI scan. His license to fight was revoked by the boxing authorities.
He had the scan, and the British Board of Control said he couldn't fight. I think Shaun was at a loose end. His career curtailed, and he weren't in a good place.
Heartbroken, Shaun struggled to keep his life on track.
And I made a few errors with, in life, and ended up doing a little bit of porridge, and I really tried to get myself back in the ring, and I was really up for getting my determination to come back, and I really believed I could still be a force and become a world champ, but I just never seemed to get the
breaks.
The breaks, Steve.
In the boxing business, it's a small, big family, so you keep hearing things. So you'd hear something, someone would say, "You seen Shaun Cummins lately?" And I'd say, "No, I haven't seen him since he boxed Neville Brown." And someone would say, "Well, he's 18 stone, he's working on the door, he's mad about bikes, he's working with Blue, the boy band, he's going to open a boxing gym. Oh, he looks like he's done loads and loads of steroids, he's 20 stone."
The rumours were true. With his boxing career over, Cummins put his talents and his reputation as a hard man to use. He put on 7 stone of muscle and found work as a bodyguard and nightclub bouncer. The journey to meeting his killer had just begun.
He was working the doors, yes, even debt collecting, I believe, at one time. And he actually ended up bodyguarding. And he was looking, before his accident, that he would be bodyguarding to the Black Eyed Peas, or even, I think, the group Blue.
As if being, as he saw it, cheated in a big fight and then losing his license to box, then reluctantly accepting a job as a nightclub heavy, in 2004, Shaun Cummins' life suffered yet another traumatic downturn.
I was involved in an accident in 2004, and I've currently been bedridden, unfortunately. I was on a motorbike. It was a lovely, clear, sunny day on a Sunday afternoon. The next thing I know, a lady's pulled straight out in front of me in a Shogun, and bingo.
Cummins had to fight for his life.
I broke my back, I broke my sternum, I broke all my rib cage on the left-hand side, I punctured a lung. It was pretty horrific. But it's remarkable, I didn't get knocked out. I lay on the road, I took my crash helmet off, and I repeatedly said my lad's name out loud, because I honestly did think it was curtains, and I wanted to go out with my lad's name at least on my lips.
Against the odds, Cummins survived the crash. After 4 months in hospital, he was allowed home, but within weeks, an accident at home left him with an infected wound which refused to heal. Doctors became gloomy about Cummins' chances of ever walking again. For now, he was bedbound.
Suddenly, you'd stick that giant man with that giant ego and that giant mentality into a bed. Not for 6 months of rehab, where he's going to come out afterwards, do a little bit of work and run off into the sunset, but for year after year after year after year.
The governor, the well-known face, the mighty boxer who was popular with the ladies and attracted roaring crowds at his fights, was lonely, bored, isolated.
Shaun had some of the boxing fraternity that raised money for him. They had venues for him, and he got that sort of, but they did sort of disappear once Shaun was, in his bed, in his little bungalow in the Saffron Lane. And yes, he didn't get many people visiting him then.
The fighter was not about to throw in the towel.
He always believed that he would walk again. He never gave up the fight. He thought that there was out there stem cell surgery to the spinal cord, and he was hoping that one day he could actually walk. He said he had feelings in his right leg.
I was initially told that I had no chance of walking again, and I would be wheelchair dependent for the rest of my life. However, I did go through a series of tests at the Leicester City Royal Infirmary, and one of the chaps there detected a little bit of movement when I was trying to push my legs, and he was leaning against them.
Cummins had been knocked down many times and in many ways, but he persevered, stuck at trying to make a living.
I've been busy working on a new website that I've launched, which is britishboxinggreats.co.uk/forum. So basically, I really enjoy myself with the boxing forum, and you know, the boxing trade has been like my extended family really, and helped me out.
But on the same radio phone-in with Steve Bunce, the commentator and longtime friend, Shaun broke the news that, in reality, his condition had got worse since his original accident.
I was involved in an accident in 2004. Now, I was hospitalised for about 4 months, and then an accident occurred at home, and I cut myself, unfortunately, on my backside, and it got infected, and I had to have a couple of operations, and so I've been stuck in bed now for 5 years.
It was very, very hard to see Shaun as he was. He was in a bad place.
The once mighty boxer, the club doorman people feared, the man who had taken more than one wrong path in his life, found himself weak, ill, reliant on others for help, reliant on a local man called Thomas Dunkley, and not everybody was happy about it.
I think Tom was obviously devious. There was an agenda somewhere.
Tom Dunkley was about to become, for Shaun Cummins, what they call in boxing a corner man. And he did have an agenda: to get rich quick. The journey to murder had begun. Tom Dunkley had offered to help a man that he considered a boxing star. Dunkley himself had been a boxer.
He'd had a go at boxing and he showed some promise. From what I was told, he looked like he could be a pretty decent fighter, but I don't think it really worked out for him.
Dunkley jumped at the chance to get close to the local hero.
He was certainly a fan, and he was certainly in awe of Shaun when he met him.
He saw Cummins as a shortcut to money and a better life. He'd heard that Shaun was setting up a new business, a private gym.
Tom Dunkley was promised a role in a gymnasium that Shaun was invested in, and Tom was going to be installed in some management or part of that business that Shaun was, funding.
He always thought the payday was around the corner.
After becoming paralysed, Cummins had won £400,000 in compensation, money that went into a trust fund for his care and his day-to-day living. So Dunkley may indeed have believed that there was money around for him to benefit from.
Dunkley and Cummins met because Dunkley was a runner for Dave Pratt. Dave Pratt was a signatory on the trust that Shaun got after his accident, and so Dunkley got involved there as a go-between for the two of them.
Dunkley would later admit that he was drawn to people with money, people whose lives were more comfortable than his. But frustrated and lonely, perhaps naively, Cummins welcomed the company.
In those early days, they'd play computer games together, and he'd just be a companion for Shaun. They had loads in common, because what they both loved was boxing.
Inside his home, Cummins gave Dunkley some training tips. They watched films, talked. Dunkley would go out and pick up takeaway for them both. They swapped boxing stories. Both sides seemed to relish the friendship. Dunkley began running errands for his bedridden friend, changing the sheets, making sure he had water, picking up medication.
Tom Dunkley was a very nice man on the outside, very quiet. There was a relationship where Shaun was actually training Tom Dunkley with the weights. So Shaun was even a trainer. He trained Tom Dunkley, and the friendship was sort of bond of that.
Tellingly, he went to the bank for Shaun, helped manage his finances. Jane Monckton-Smith, a leading criminologist, has been reviewing events surrounding the lives of Shaun Cummins and Tom Dunkley.
He was quite trusted, and he was trusted with his finances and things like that, and he would run errands for him. So it was quite a general role, and perhaps there was even kind of a friendship there between them.
Not that Dunkley made an ideal carer.
Tom Dunkley prepared meals for Shaun, and in the kitchen it was not the tidiest, and it was, unhealthy, unhygienic. And I said to Shaun at the time that I don't think you should have him cooking your food for you. But Shaun said he's my friend, and they were a partnership.
Shaun's injuries and disability meant that he needed regular medication. He had daily visits at home from community nurses. It would be those same health workers who later realised that something was wrong in Shaun Cummins' world. What would set the alarm bells ringing?
A community nurse got suspicious about what was going on at the house. She wasn't happy with Thomas Dunkley.
As time wore on inside the house, frictions became apparent. Hard men like Shaun Cummins don't change overnight. True to his reputation, Cummins was not an easy or grateful patient.
Medical professionals who'd seen him would say that Shaun could be difficult, he could be very demanding.
He may have been paralyzed, but Cummins was still, in his mind, the governor. He could be moody, overbearing, even violent towards Dunkley.
And I think there were probably times when he lost his temper with Dunkley and got aggressive with him.
It seemed to be an unequal friendship, one physically able but bullied and perhaps even abused, the other reduced to a shadow of his former self, but still able to throw a punch at his so-called friend. What made Thomas Dunkley stick around? Where was he earning money? Certainly not from Shaun Cummins. To those closest to Cummins, something simply didn't ring true.
Shaun believed he worked for somebody and his boss was letting him come and care for him. I knew that he had a family, but he was always round Shaun's. You know, and it was strange.
Well, there was no financial arrangement between Dunkley and Cummins. That was part of Dunkley's problem. I think he always thought he would get paid for being a carer, for looking after Shaun.
And he needed the money.
At the time we got involved in the investigation, Dunkley's finances were in a pretty poor state. He was in debt to the tune of north of £15,000.
The gymnasium that Cummins would co-own and where Dunkley hoped to be given a lucrative job never materialised. The payday Dunkley was holding out for never arrived. In fact, Cummins never paid Dunkley a penny for the years of fetching and carrying, cooking and cleaning. How did Dunkley feel when he realised his caring services were all for nothing?
I think that he became weary of waiting for this, and probably more and more bitter. But I think ultimately that's what drove him to do what he did.
Broke, trapped in a toxic friendship, Thomas Dunkley felt used. For 2 years he'd been Shaun Cummins' de facto carer. He'd given up his job, got into debt, lost his girlfriend, all to become an unpaid errand assistant, cook, cleaner, general whipping boy for the egotistical former boxing champ known as the Governor. That's how Dunkley saw it. It was time to cash in on his arrangement with Shaun Cummins, but what exactly would that mean? The relationship between the two men inside a modest house was, for one of them, all about money. On the 2nd of September 2012, a community nurse arrived at Shaun Cummins' bungalow for a routine visit. Dunkley answered the door and told her the patient wasn't there.
This was a regular visit, turned up at the house to look after Shaun, and Dunkley answered the door and he sent them away.
She'd been told by Thomas Dunkley that Shaun was in hospital, and he told her that he'd been taken ill and had to go into hospital.
When she'd visited the previous day, Cummins had been weak and unwell. He had pneumonia and was suffering from bladder and kidney infections.
The fact is, Shaun had been ill, and the nurses knew this. His community nurses had visited him, and he was ill. So hearing this on the 1st of September, as she did, it was no massive surprise to her.
A few days later, the previously penniless Tom Dunkley appeared to have come into money.
So by the 4th of September, Thomas Dunkley had started spending Shaun's money. He had gone to the bank, he'd drawn out cash, he started eating out, buying himself clothes. He even went and bought a car. I think he took about £11,000 out of Shaun's bank account. And this was something that he can't have thought about very deeply, because this is something that's going to come back on him.
It would be over a week before the nurse realised that something was terribly wrong in that little bungalow.
They started making inquiries. They couldn't find any record of Shaun in the hospital. So they called him, they called his phone.
9-10 days later, when nobody had heard anything of Shaun, she rang the house. And Dunkley immediately put her on guard because he answered the phone and pretended to be Shaun. And she thought, how strange.
He must have been at some level panicking to have said something that was so ridiculous.
He was insisting still now, 9-10 days after she'd first seen him, that Shaun was still in hospital and that he was in a hospital near Dudley in the West Midlands. The conversation ended and the nurse, very switched on, you know, a medical professional, she just wasn't having any of that. She didn't believe a word he was saying. So she started to make her own inquiries, and she inquired with Leicester Hospitals Trust and rang various hospitals in the West Midlands, in the Dudley area, rang the GP that Shaun used. Nobody had any record of Shaun Cummins being admitted to hospital. So she rang the police.
Leicestershire's police missing persons team called Dunkley. Like the nurse, they weren't convinced about what they were discovering, specifically no sight nor sound of Shaun Cummins and a worried community nurse.
They had a conversation. She told the officer what she thought. He then called Thomas Dunkley and he had a conversation with him, and he wasn't happy either. Immediately, senses on alert, he thought, no, that's not right.
So they went round to the house.
And when they couldn't get a response at the address, they forced entry.
The police officers were about to make a gruesome discovery.
The first thing they found when they forced entry was something they smelled. What they smelled was what we in the police and what any police officer will tell you is called the smell of death. There's no smell like it, and when you smell it, you know what it is. So those officers, as they moved into that house, knew they were looking for a body by this time.
What had happened to Shaun Cummins?
It was unbelievable what actually happened in that house.
The fighter had fought his last bout, and he had lost. The public could not yet be told about what officers had discovered at the home of Shaun Cummins. First, the family had to be notified.
I was actually on holiday at the time. They phoned me up and just said there'd been a death at the house. They didn't say who it was. And I said, well, it's Shaun then.
Could the champion boxer, he wondered, have finally succumbed to the catastrophic injuries and illnesses that had blighted his life for so many years?
He'd had bouts of illnesses, but always recovered from them. He was a fighter.
Steve would soon learn that his brother had not succumbed to illness. His death had been a violent one. But apart from the awful stench, at first, police searching the property saw little.
There was nothing particularly about the state of the property to say that anything had happened, other than what they found. Later, detailed forensic examination found minute blood traces and things like that. But generally speaking, no, there was no sign of a disturbance. It wasn't a very tidy house.
But they couldn't escape the overpowering smell. They kept on looking.
What they found was something a hell of a lot worse than just finding a body. What they found when they started to get into the kitchen was 3 freezers. And within the freezers were the 10 body parts of the decapitated Shaun Cummins.
The dismemberment of his body indicated he had been murdered. Dame Sue Black is a world-renowned expert in analysing why and how a body is dismembered.
So a murder has usually occurred before you have dismemberment, and suddenly you're faced with a body and you have the panic that says, how do I get rid of it?
I believe that Shaun had actually died from an illness for a start until I found out the graphics of the case.
Senior Detective Steve Shuttleworth realised that there were many people who Shaun had come into contact with over the years who might be capable of violent crime.
Shaun Cummins came from a world where not only was he a boxer, which is a profession that can attract trouble, he also then went on to be not only a doorman but also a bodyguard. And again, we're talking about 2 professions that attract trouble. So these were always going to be lines of inquiry that had to be followed.
Shaun was a bit of an on-edge character. Some people might call him a bully. I did hear there was a prison sentence. I did hear that he'd had plenty of run-ins. I did hear that he was upsetting all sorts of people in Leicester. And that doesn't surprise me. That would be classified as fairly Shaun Cummins behaviour.
Despite having made enemies around town, detectives' instincts suggested that the field of suspects might soon be narrowed down to just one: Shaun's friend and helper, Thomas Dunkley. He was missing. What was that about?
But what we're really talking about here is the fact that Thomas Dunkley has caused this suspicion. A body has been found in an address where Thomas Dunkley says Shaun wasn't and that he was in hospital. And really getting to the point, Thomas Dunkley's nowhere to be seen.
At that point, no precise cause of death could actually be ascertained.
One of the complications in this case was that because Shaun's body had been dismembered and into about 10 parts, I think, it was impossible for the forensic pathologist to actually find what the cause of death was.
But the decision to dismember Shaun's body says much about the killer.
Most people who find themselves in a situation of having committed a murder or a homicide don't think about the problem of the body. And the body is a problem.
The killer may have thought cutting up Shaun's body might mean that he could hide his murder.
He may have thought that if he got rid of the body entirely and was able to clean that scene entirely, that was a way out for him. So I think the chopping up of the body parts was a precursor to getting rid of those body parts.
We call it an aggressive form of dismemberment because it is about rendering the body down into parts for the purposes of hiding them, of transporting them somewhere else so that you can hide them away. So you're trying to conceal the fact that a death has occurred. The dismemberment itself is really just a practical extension of the situation the individual finds themselves in now with a body. How do you get rid of it?
By buying a chainsaw, the killer may have thought chopping up a body would be easy. Another mistake.
And clearly, Shaun was a man who was very big. His body weight in stones numbered in the 20s. He was a massive guy. He was an immensely strong man, even when he was disabled and in that bed. And that, he could never have got rid of Shaun's body in one piece. So for me, this was him preparing to get rid of that body in parts, and I think that's what his plan was.
I think people believe they are more forensically aware than they actually are, and that's largely to do with television telling them, you know, I did this and this is what happened. They then have a go at it perhaps themselves and find that it is not easy. It is a really difficult thing to do, to dismember a body, both psychologically but actually physically as well, because a body of an adult is a heavy thing. It's wet because you've got a copious amounts of blood and fat that will start to liquefy as you touch it. And you're also trying to get a contact between a blade and tissue. So it's physically very demanding.
Leicestershire's homicide police needed to find Thomas Dunkley and uncover exactly what had gone on in the bungalow owned by Shaun Cummins. They followed the evidence, the clues a killer may have left behind.
So the forensic side of the investigation starts to take place, and meanwhile the search for Thomas Dunkley commences. And we quickly find that he has borrowed his brother's car and gone off in his brother's car, and the registration number is provided to the officers that were called out on that night.
Officers suspected that whoever had dismembered Shaun's body would have needed tools. They trawled through images caught by in-store cameras at nearby DIY stores.
We had Dunkley on CCTV buying the chainsaw.
He buys overalls and face masks and bags. For the previous week, he'd been functioning quite normally. He'd been going out, he'd been spending his money, nobody had been really suspicious about his actions. And then all of a sudden on the 7th, we get this big change where he takes things a whole step further and buys that equipment.
Further inquiries proved that Dunkley had used Shaun's credit card. Was the chainsaw used to dismember Shaun's body? this was a key turning point in the investigation. It offered a clear idea of what might have happened, a credible narrative for officers to investigate. Detectives, when searching Shaun Cummins' house, had found a laptop. They wondered if further evidence might emerge of Dunkley's guilt.
The laptop computer that was of most interest was one that we thought Dunkley had been using at the address.
He's just a very sick man. For the idea of thinking he could get away with it.
Straight away, they felt that they could reconstruct the hard drive of the computer and get the information, and they did. And they got a huge tranche of information.
And there were Google searches around the same day that was the last time that Shaun was seen.
Amongst which were search engine trawls which could only have been made by Dunkley. What happens when you're stabbed in the stomach? How long does it take to die after you're stabbed?
What happens when somebody bleeds to death?
What happens if you cut a carotid artery? How long does it take to die? How long does a body take to go off? Searches like that. What happens if you inject bleach into the veins? So searches about how to kill, and then later searches about what do you do with the body when you've got it.
It's quite surprising the amount of people who commit a murder or plan to commit a murder will go onto the internet and search how to do that. And it's not a sensible thing to do if you don't want to get caught. You know, it leaves a forensic trail.
Shuttleworth and his team now felt certain they could get a conviction. But where was their chief suspect?
We quickly find that he has borrowed his brother's car. That started to show up after a few hours because it went through an automatic number plate recognition camera on the M1 going northbound, and then ultimately a call came in to say that one of their armed response vehicles had found the car on the Woolly Edge services in Wakefield.
In the early hours of the 13th of September, Dunkley was arrested just 85 miles from the scene of the crime. Pathology reports suggested that Shaun Cummins had died days before his body parts were found, throughout which time it seemed Thomas Dunkley had stayed put.
Dunkley stayed living effectively in the house after killing him. Now we think that he killed Shaun sometime around about the 1st of September.
12 days later, he had bolted. Why wait so long? It appeared that Dunkley thought he had plenty of time to cover his tracks. He was now in police custody, and he had a story to tell. Yes, he was in the house where Shaun's dismembered body parts had been. Yes, he was captured on CCTV buying equipment which could have been used in the dismemberment. Yes, he may have cut the body up, but Shaun had simply died. Dunkley had not known what to do on finding his friend's body.
He said to the police that Shaun had died in his sleep of natural causes, and for some reason he had panicked and decided that he needed to get rid of the body.
Dunkley admitted chainsawing up Shaun's body, but I don't remember him ever discussing how hard it was. I found Dunkley from listening to him give evidence in court, and particularly from his police interviews, and the interviewing officers felt this too. He was really calm, he was really in control. He was a good liar.
I don't think anybody actually believed that. It does seem like a very strange thing to claim after the event. Why wouldn't you call an ambulance? But that's what he said.
Had Dunkley made a mistake which would lead to a guilty verdict in a court of law? Or might he get away with it? The challenge facing detectives now that Thomas Dunkley had been arrested on suspicion of the murder of Shaun Cummins was to get the evidence needed to secure a conviction to uncover the killer's mistake. When he was arrested, Thomas Dunkley told police that Cummins had died in his sleep.
There's always got to be some doubt, and when you're investigating a murder or investigating any serious crime, you have to investigate every relevant line of inquiry.
It was time to review the evidence before it was put to the jury, which, if any, would be the mistake that would lead to Dunkley's conviction.
Thomas Dunkley said that he had not murdered Shaun Cummins. He said that Shaun had died of natural causes. And he pointed to the fact that we knew Shaun had been ill, and he said having noticed that Shaun had died, he panicked, and he thought he may get the blame for that, and the story wasn't all that plausible, really. I mean, who does that?
Maybe nobody, but that was not enough to take to court.
We had Dunkley on CCTV buying the chainsaw he used to chop Shaun's body up. He bought that from a local DIY store, just a couple of miles away from where Shaun lived. He bought it with Shaun's credit card. He was already using his murder victim's credit card by this time. And he bought a lot of other kit that he would need, kit to clean up with. He bought the incinerator, which he later used to burn things in the garden. He bought his coveralls, mask and shoe protectors.
In fact, Dunkley was recorded again and again on CCTV, seemingly relaxed over several days, as he used Cummins' credit cards to gather together everything that he needed to dispose of the boxer's body. He didn't go on the run after the killing because he thought he could cover all traces of his crime.
It's hard to pin down exactly, but he was buying things to chop the body up on around about the 7th of September. By this time, he'd realised that it was starting to smell in there and he needed to do something. And he thought if he chopped up the body parts and froze them, he'd get rid of the smell.
Dunkley didn't realise that in plotting to make Cummins disappear, he had left a trail of digital evidence that proved exactly what he wanted to do. Was this his ultimate mistake? Over the next few days, police were to uncover other flaws in his planning. His brother was hearing more of Shaun's death.
I found out the research that Dunkley had, how long does it take to die from a stab wound to the neck?
Dunkley would continue to deny that he had played any part in Cummins' death, but detectives felt they had enough to charge him with murder.
There was CPS advice with what we had from interview, with the chopping up of the body, and we had things like a next door neighbour had a carer who saw him burning things in the garden and thought that was very suspicious. We had him running from the police. Clearly, the fact that Shaun had been chopped into 10 pieces and he was admitting doing that.
From the moment that Dunkley took the decision to kill, he began making mistakes. The decision to dismember Shaun's body, a classic error. It immediately put him in the frame.
In dismemberments, the victim and the suspect know each other. And so it normally occurs in the property associated with one or either individual. It would be extremely rare for a dismemberment to be stranger-oriented. Most of them are because there's been some form of personal conflict between the two individuals. So we will always go and look at areas that are known to the victim and the suspect, the homes of the victim and the suspect, looking for evidence that the dismemberment has occurred.
Dunkley's next mistake was thinking that he could erase his digital footprint.
The laptop computer that was of most interest was one that we thought Dunkley had been using at the address, and the initial findings from that laptop were disappointing.
The hard drive on Dunkley's laptop had been corrupted. Detectives sent it to IT experts who found his search history.
And they got a huge tranche of information which we were able to attribute to Thomas Dunkley, which was a mass of searches about how to kill somebody. And we were able to attribute those to Thomas Dunkley.
Dunkley made those online searches between the 1st and 2nd of September, hours after Cummins was last seen alive by the community nurse. It was the last piece of the puzzle the police needed to prove that Dunkley had deliberately killed Cummins. Believing he could beat the computer experts, failing to destroy his laptop, these were fatal mistakes for the killer. But what was his motive? Continuing to deny the murder, Dunkley never gave police an explanation. But all the evidence suggested money and greed had a lot to do with it.
I think he was there just after Shaun's money. Basically, I think that was the crux.
He used Shaun's identity to get loans, but he did, with that money, with money he got, start to repay things.
When Cummins was still alive, Dunkley had abused his position as his carer to treat Cummins' trust fund as Dunkley's own personal bank account. After the murder, the scale of his theft and deception escalated.
He went to a local Vauxhall dealer and put a deposit down on a car. He went to see a mortgage advisor and he bought all sorts of things for members of his family. I think he bought a washing machine for somebody and he bought toys for children who he was related to and other things. They must have wondered where the money was coming from because he never had any money. But he went off spending Shaun's money.
Police traced when and where Cummins' cards had been used. Dunkley was caught 3 times on CCTV using cash machines to draw money out of Cummins' account. Dunkley's spending spree gave detectives everything they needed to prove the motive for his terrible crimes. Detectives suspected he was taking what he thought was rightfully his.
I think Thomas Dunkley always thought he would ultimately get some reward and some pay for the amount of care he was giving. And I think that he became weary of waiting for this and probably more and more bitter. I think Thomas Dunkley saw Shaun as something of a bully, and that's not something we've got any evidence for, but I think ultimately that's what drove him to do what he did.
In court, the police convincingly made the case that Dunkley had been motivated by greed. He admitted to stealing over £10,000 from Shaun Cummins. Despite his claims of innocence, the jury found him guilty of murder. The police were satisfied that a cold, calculating and dangerous man had been locked away.
He was found guilty and he was handed down a large sentence, which was initially 34 years, to go with his life sentence. He was calm, and I've thought that since when he came to the appeal. A very calm man and able to hold it together, so maybe the kind of person who could carry out that act without it troubling him too much.
Even the police were shocked by this crime. It's a particularly awful crime. It's not only has there been a murder, which is bad enough, it's what he did with Shaun's body afterwards. An awfully shocking thing to do, and says so many things about Thomas Dunkley, because not many people would be capable of dismembering a body.
Thomas Dunkley was far from a clever killer. Aside from choosing a method of disposing of the body which immediately put him in the frame, he left an indelible digital record of his every movement, including being captured on camera soon after the murder.
CCTV played a big part in the murder investigation. We had Dunkley on CCTV buying the chainsaw.
There are 6 million cameras in public spaces throughout the United Kingdom, more than anywhere in the Western world. Thomas Dunkley had made many mistakes before, during and after the murder of Shaun Cummins. But for detectives, the key turning point, the killer's mistake, was being caught on camera using a stolen credit card and buying precisely the kit that he would need to dismember a body.
Amongst the many mistakes that Dunkley made, the one that he really couldn't find an explanation for or wriggle out of was going out and buying the equipment to dismember Shaun's body. There's no excuse for that. There's nothing he could come up with in court that would explain that away. And so probably, of his many mistakes, that was the biggest one.
It was a mistake which cost him a sentence that will not see him eligible to parole until 2047. Not that Thomas Dunkley appeared to care as he stood in the court dock.
He was calm. Usually, you get a lot of shouting, or you get crying, falling about, and you get relatives shouting and screaming. Thomas Dunkley, calm. His head went down a little bit because he just let his life go, but he was calm.
In Spokane County, Washington, 3 women are brutally murdered.
All 3 of the victims were found near the river.
With a possible serial killer on the loose, police are extra vigilant.
They were meticulous in collecting every bit of evidence they could, even what they couldn't imagine might be helpful later on, years later.
One victim had not made it easy for her attacker.
She obviously battled well enough to collect DNA under her fingernails of skin from him, doing it to collect enough skin so that would be still there 20 years later.
Eventually, detectives uncover a suspect. There's a problem, though. Evidence suggests that the serial killer is a man, but their suspect is a woman.
You want me to take my pants off and show you?
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Donna Perry as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake?
When you kill somebody, you're going to get caught.
Spokane, Washington is a city that looks like it just has it all. It's nestled along a river. It's edged by mountains and forests. It even has a rushing waterfall running through the center of town. It's just lovely.
In the 1980s, recession hit this pretty town with an industrial past. The decline of manufacturing led to pay cuts, job losses, and for some, real, grinding poverty. It was against this backdrop that grim discoveries were made on the riverside.
My name is Jim Hansen. I'm a retired detective from Spokane County Sheriff's Department. In 1990, I was one of the detectives involved in the investigation of 3 prostitutes that were killed in Spokane County and city. This is primarily the area where a lot of the girls worked. We don't know exactly where any of the 3 girls were picked up. We know the areas that they worked. In the evening, it was dimly lit. You know, there were a number of taverns, but primarily the businesses were closed and the girls were just, you know, walking the sidewalks.
So who were these women? All 3 of the women had worked as prostitutes along East Sprague Avenue in Spokane. They were friends, they'd known each other, they worked the same area, town. They all had families who loved them. Some of them had actually lived together in an old motel not far from where they worked.
Over the decade of the 80s, there were a number of different prostitute killings. And then in 1990, within about a 5-month period, we had 3 that were definitely linked together. All 3 of the homicides were brutal in the fact that a gun was used. All 3 of the victims were found near the river. So there were a number of facts that binded these 3 together.
Yolanda Sapp was 26. Yolanda had been shot 3 times in the chest. Her body was found nude and sprawled over an embankment just for the whole world to see. The bracelets and the necklace that she was known to have worn were gone.
That was on February 22nd, 1990.
A month later, in March of 1990, Nikki Lowe, she was 34 years old. Her body was found under the Green Street Bridge. She was partially nude. She died of a single gunshot wound to the chest.
Nikki Lowe's crime scene provided the first clues.
Missing were her tennis shoes and her red wallet, But those items were later found by a resident in the area. They were found in a dumpster. And some of that evidence that was found in that dumpster would later wind up leading to the killer.
Then came the third shocking murder of a vulnerable East Sprague Avenue sex worker in just 4 months. 14 years later, a detective fresh to the investigation would revisit the events of that night.
I am Jim Dressbeck, a retired detective with the Spokane County Sheriff's Office. In 2004, I took over cases for another retired detective, and one of those cases was the Kathy Brisboe case.
Kathy Brisboe was 38. She was a mother and a grandmother. Her body was found on the west side of the Spokane River in Spokane Valley.
So we're generally in the area of Trenton Pines, right along the banks of the Spokane River, and this is where Kathy Brisboe's body was eventually recovered. And we believe that she was brought here, probably drove her in here, and I think basically they came here to do the sex act, whatever that was, and that either before, during, or after, she must have had some sort of event that caused her enough concern that she probably tried to get away from him. They got into a fight here.
She put up a really good fight.
And then if you go down this little path, down to the bottom, at the bottom of the hill is where we started finding blood drops and clumps of hair that were pulled out.
Kathy said, that she would not go down easy. And so, based on everything that I knew about her, she was a fighter.
Kathy's death was brutal.
And basically, she was fighting for her life.
She had suffered a powerful blow to the head. Her skull was fractured. She had 3 broken ribs. This was a fight that did not go down fast.
Starting in this area, we started to see some blood drops and some pieces of hair and clumps of hair on the ground. And right down here on that bush here was a sundress. Just a little bit past that is a spot where you look over the edge and her body was visible from up here. So when you stand here looking down, you can see it pretty easily. Just like the others weren't in any way. There was no attempt to hide the bodies in either of the other two. They were just disposed of in those locations.
What detectives didn't know at the time was that Kathy's determination to live would provide vital evidence. But not for decades later, and then only after solving a mystery like no other.
She collected DNA by scratching, fighting, kicking, whatever. She got his DNA embedded under her fingernails enough that it was viable 28, 9 years later, that they could still get a sample from that.
Fingernail clippings, that was routine in an autopsy. So it wasn't anything special that was done in that particular case because that was routine and done in every case. Just those little things like that back in 1990 didn't mean as much as they do today.
The investigation was passed between officers whose service spanned decades. Breakthroughs proved elusive, but everyone was sure they were looking for a man.
Everybody believed that those murders were committed by the same person.
Uncovering the killer's mistake, the one which would lead to his arrest, was destined never to be easy. When the murders began, policing was in a different age.
We had no computers, so our information would come in from the street. You would try to contact working prostitutes, try to get information from them. You have to establish a priority, for one thing. You could be chasing tips forever. So you just try to follow through with the information and see where it leads you. I think serial killing homicide investigation is a very uneven platform. One day you're up really high, you think you've really come across something, the lead, fails, and boom, down you go. And so it's just a kind of a roller coaster.
The DNA taken from under the fingernails of Kathy Brisboe did not match that of anybody on a database. This was before nationwide databases of DNA had even been considered. But detectives tried everything they knew.
You try to get into his mind as much as you can, but it's a guessing game. You try to take a look at the evidence that you've recovered, what the lab may have found out, fingerprints, you follow up on any of that. And I believe we worked on that probably a year on and off, worked on it as much as we could.
They talked to every possible witness. They had something like 600 or 700 different leads. But they were very careful in collecting this evidence and talking to as many people as they could.
This case became cold probably in 91, 92. And, there's other cases out there, other homicides that you're working, other long involved investigations. So it goes cold, but it's not forgotten. So you're always hoping that something is going to come forward that's going to help somebody at this point in an old case.
Over the 20-year investigation, detectives came across a man who had lived in Spokane around the time of the killings. His name, Douglas Perry. He appeared to be a friend to the sex workers of East Sprague Avenue. He would take them to his home, cook them meals. He talked about getting them off the streets. One of the troubled women that Doug befriended became his girlfriend.
Claire Ann, who was a prostitute and hooked on cocaine, and Doug was trying to get her out of that life. Was trying to get her, so he could marry her, so he had this shot at the white picket fence. Storybook ending.
Doug Perry's intentions were not entirely pure.
He seems fixated on prostitutes. He stalks them, he befriends them, he makes use of their services. Clearly, Doug is obsessed with prostitutes, but he has a complicated relationship with them.
Perry was living in Seattle at the time of the murders of Kathy, Yolanda, and Nikki. Obsessive about sex workers, he was dating one who he wanted to, in his eyes, save from the streets. But he was not on the police radar, because nobody other than the girls themselves, and Douglas himself, knew. He had never been recorded as a suspect. He had not made a killer's mistake. Or so he thought.
This is the portrait of a killer, obsessed with two things: guns and prostitutes. And the intersection of those two things will turn him into a serial killer.
Douglas Perry had a complicated life, whichever way you look at it. He might claim to care about the sex workers of East Sprague Avenue, but in fact, he had a much greater passion in his life: guns, which investigators would one day discover.
He really seemed to have an affinity to guns. He loved them a lot because every time he was arrested and a search warrant was done in his house, there were dozens of firearms.
Brian Harris spent decades as a murder squad detective in Houston, Texas. He's been analyzing reports made by Spokane police.
They describe how he refers to weapons almost as you would a child, very affectionate and passionate when talking about weapons, not just about the parts, but almost as if it's a lover. When he describes a firearm, it's almost as if it's taken on a human characteristics and he's in love with the actual weapon itself.
Just where did the twin obsession of Douglas Perry, guns and prostitutes, come from? His was an extremely troubled childhood.
Doug Perry was living as a child in an orchard in Omak, Washington, which is kind of this north-central part of the state of Washington. It's rural, predominantly farming, ranching communities. And his family had an orchard, so he was raised on that orchard. Father, mother, older brother, and I think 2 sisters.
It was far from a storybook childhood. Douglas's father had sexually abused him. His mother wasn't much of a parent.
So that certainly would be problematic, picked on in the family, and abused in, I think, emotionally, sexually, and physically, beat up.
And then there were the guns. His father was a military weapons expert who would encourage the teenage Doug Perry to practice his shooting.
He would take Doug out target shooting, and those were happy memories for Doug. They may have begun his lifelong obsession with guns.
Perfecting his skill with a rifle became an obsession for Perry Jr. It was his only connection with his father, but the young Douglas Perry was simply not destined to have it easy.
When Doug was 16 years old, his father suddenly died from a burst blood vessel. And Douglas's mother, who would have been the primary caretaker, really wasn't there for him. She had some problems of her own. She wound up institutionalized for severe schizophrenia. So Douglas was pretty much on his own from a young age.
It's perhaps no surprise that Douglas Perry grew to become an odd, aggressively hostile man, close to nobody, and known to the police.
Doug's criminal history starts pretty early on. We know at least starts in his 20s. He is arrested on a series of assault charges and weapons violations.
Douglas Perry had been in and out of the system since the 1970s. Crime after crime after crime, yet he'd serve his little bit of sentence and he'd get out. He'd serve his little bit of sentence and get out. And it can be very frustrating in general for society and law enforcement when they see that kind of activity.
When 36, Perry's criminal history hit a new milestone.
In 1988, Doug gets his first felony weapons charges.
Douglas had progressed from guns that he might use for shooting practice as a young man to something a whole lot more serious.
I believe what he was doing was making some type of a homemade explosive. And so he got busted.
Police found a massive weapons cache, 5 pipe bombs, 49 guns, 20,000 rounds of ammunition, all in his house.
Now, from this point on, Doug is no longer allowed to legally own guns, which is a big problem for someone as gun-obsessed as Doug is.
2 years before the triple murders by the river in Spokane, Doug Perry had served time for illegal ownership of weapons, but his DNA was not taken. It was the era before such routines were followed.
We did not have DNA in 1990. So you always collect your evidence the same way. And I believe that's what helped in this case. DNA eventually was able to be obtained from that evidence that was collected.
It had been Perry's social worker who tipped police off in 1994 about his stash of deadly weapons. The social workers were also aware of something else. Perry appeared to be a misogynist.
He didn't like women. He found them disgusting and vile. At least the women that were involved in the sex trade, that were prostitutes. He viewed them as pond scum.
Doug's hatred of women was based on a view that he would soon voice in prison.
From 1995 to 1997, Douglas Perry spends time in prison on that weapons violation. During his stay, he reportedly tells a fellow inmate that he has killed around 9 prostitutes because he hated them.
He viewed women as baby-making machines. Their purpose on this earth was to create life, to carry babies. And when he would look at these prostitutes, these streetwalkers, he looked at them with disgust.
That conversation with a cellmate wasn't reported for over 15 years, but it would later give detectives a crucial insight into his bitter, hateful mind, and it would allow prosecutors to paint him as a man with a strong motive to kill. Within months of his release from prison, Spokane cops did find out how often Perry spent time with sex workers and the other obsession in his life, weapons.
In 1998, a year after Douglas gets out of prison, he picks up a prostitute and brings her to his home.
And she was really creeped out about the weapons, all the weapons around, and how he was saying he wasn't going to hurt her because he liked her.
She sees knives, she sees guns, she sees crossbows. It freaks her out.
And so when he took her back downtown to the street corner, she flagged down the first cop, she said, and said, "I want to tell you about this weird date that I just had."
While she's talking to police, Douglas Perry drives by, and police pull him over.
Once again, Douglas Perry's obsessions with guns, knives, bombs, and prostitutes have threatened to expose him for who and what he really was.
He's stopped by the Spokane Police Department, and inside of his vehicle, there is writings about his mental health, and it's from mental health workers about his disdain and disgust for women.
They also find in that car some other papers describing the steps to take to get gender reassignment surgery.
Detectives thought no more about this unusual discovery, but because Perry's arms cache was found, he was sent to jail. It seems remarkable today, but still, Douglas Perry's DNA was not taken. Whilst in prison, Doug made a decision that he hoped would change his life.
10 years after Yolanda and Nikki and Kathy were murdered, Douglas Perry takes a trip. Douglas Perry flies to Bangkok, Thailand, and has gender reassignment surgery.
It's in Thailand that Douglas Perry becomes Donna Perry.
The effect of the gender realignment treatment around the year 2000 made life even more difficult for investigating detectives looking into the triple murder of 1990. By then, it was a cold case. DNA techniques had not helped find a match for tracers found under the fingernails of Kathy Brisboe, and there had been plenty of other murders between then and now to keep detectives occupied. By becoming Donna, Douglas Perry had put himself further away from the investigative radar screen of Spokane police. The 1990 murder of 3 prostitutes in Spokane, Washington remained unsolved when the original detective Jim Hansen retired.
Well, this case became cold probably in 91, 92. The work that we did at the time was all we could have done. But you're always living with it.
They worked really hard in 1990 on this, and they just ran out of people.
I left the sheriff's office. I retired from the sheriff's office in 1996, and it was still unsolved at that point. It goes cold, but it's not forgotten.
In 2004, I took over cases, and one of those cases was the Kathy Brisboe case.
By then, new investigative tools had become available.
As the years go by, DNA technology advances. So detectives on these cold case squads are resubmitting evidence in hopes of getting a break in these old cold cases.
It was first assigned in 2004 because improvements had been made in DNA processing, and it had become so much more sensitive that there may be some items that now could be tested for DNA and get results where, 10 years prior, there was no way that they would have been submitted.
And among the evidence that detectives submit to a lab in Marysville, Washington for retesting are fingernail clippings from Kathy Brisboe.
It took a while. There was a massive backlog of work. Errors were made, but the results of the test were telling.
Well, in 2009, not 6 months after the case was sent to the Marysville lab, I got a call from one of the scientists that asked me to sit down, which I always love when you get a call that says, "Are you sitting down?" Because it never seems to mean bad news what I was doing. So I said, "Oh yeah." She said that she developed a full male nuclear profile from under the left middle finger of Kathy Brisboe. And therefore, that then is a huge lead.
Almost 20 years after Yolanda Sapp, Nikki Lowe and Kathy Brisboe had been brutally murdered, it seemed like the breakthrough that cops had waited for had arrived. They'd always thought the killer was a man. Might there be a match on the newly established system?
It's entered in a combined DNA indexing system, one of which is in the state of Washington, the other one is a national database. And then it's routinely run every time somebody's DNA is entered. But if you've been convicted of a felony in the state of Washington, then your DNA is taken as ordered by the court. So it's run against all of those continuously, every day.
The problem is they run it through the database and it doesn't match up with anyone.
Douglas Perry had been arrested several times, but never had DNA taken. The DNA taken from under Kathy Brisboe's fingernails didn't match any of the convicted felons in the national system. But Jim Dresbach and his colleagues on the Cold Case Squad weren't giving up.
Once we got a full male profile, it was just a matter of time. That's going to be resolved one way or the other.
Eventually, Dresbach figured the killer would commit another crime. He just had to wait for the man who had claimed the lives of Kathy, Yolanda, and Nikki to make a mistake, which Donna Perry did.
Donna Perry may have changed her outer being, still didn't change who she was on the inside, that fascination with firearms. So Donna Perry gets arrested on, yet again, another federal firearms charge.
It happens in Spokane Valley, just outside the city of Spokane, in March of 2012. Donna Perry is spotted at a White Elephant store there. She's buying ammunition and a pistol magazine, a clip for a gun. And the retired detective sees her and knows that this is a felon and is not allowed to legally own firearms. So Donna Perry is arrested. And this arrest will change everything.
She ultimately ended up pleading guilty, and she had to be brought back to Spokane for that court hearing.
As a convicted felon, Donna Perry is now required to submit a DNA sample to be entered into the national database of convicted felons.
But now it's 2012. DNA has really come to the forefront. And there's a federal requirement, as well as many states, that once you're incarcerated, you have to provide a sample of your DNA. You see, Donna Perry thought she could change her outer look, but the way she is molecularly designed on the inside, that will never change.
A lab technician in Washington State gets a hit.
The detectives in Spokane are notified that there is now a DNA link.
Donna Perry's DNA sample is a direct match to the DNA profile found under the fingernail of Kathy Brisboe. This is huge, but there's a twist. That DNA profile was that of a male. Just who is Donna Perry? What kind of secrets has she been hiding? So now detectives have to start putting together the pieces to figure out how this could be.
They visit Donna Perry, the woman arrested for a gun crime who appeared to have the DNA of the man who they had been looking for, the one who had left behind his DNA under the fingernails of Kathy Brisboe.
All we got to do is we got to get together with her and get a sample, which is a buccal swab, which amounts to swabbing, between the cheek and gum with essentially a Q-tip, putting it in a box and shipping it off and waiting for them to come back and say, yep, it's a match, or no, it's not.
In the meantime, police wasted no time in finding out more about Donna Perry and the man she'd once been, Doug Perry.
Who is Doug Perry? Where did Doug Perry come from? Where did Doug Perry live? Who were the neighbors? Who were the friends? Who were, what was his family like? The history, what kind of vehicles did he drive was a big deal, because we believed that to one degree or another, and I think every degree really, all three of these victims were transported in one fashion or another to the scene where they ended up.
Inside the house, they find a dozen guns and 12,000 rounds of ammunition. But that's not all they find. One of the agents notices that the closet door is painted shut. So they pry open the door. They think maybe there are more guns in there. But instead, they find something else, really strange. They find several boxes filled with women's underwear. Too small for Perry to wear. They're frilly and they're lacy and they look old. And it strikes this ATF agent as being really bizarre. He's a seasoned cop, and to him, these look like the sorts of trophies that serial killers keep to sort of relive the crime.
Donna Perry's DNA came back as a confirmed match for the profile taken from the DNA found under Kathy Brisbo's fingernails.
You've identified a suspect, so now you start working on the suspect. You do, your backgrounds. You try to figure out where the suspect was. You've got a whole list of things to do reference that suspect. You've got to be able to put the suspect back in Spokane at the time of the homicides. You've got to run down vehicles that the suspect may have had, residences. There's just a lot of things to go, and you've got to be able to tie each homicide to the suspect. So you're going through all the evidence. You're resubmitting evidence for fingerprint comparisons, and all that takes time.
When investigators re-examined evidence from the 3 crime scenes, the case against Perry was stacking up.
They have the evidence matching Perry to Kathy Brisbo. Now they need more evidence to link to the other victims.
Nikki Lowe had Perry's fingerprint on one of the items that belonged to her. It was in a dumpster, I don't know, a mile, 2 miles away from where her body was recovered. Then Yolanda Sapp had a couple of blankets that were deposited with the body.
And I believe there was DNA of Perry's on the blanket that was found. So that ties those two together.
All of it matches Perry.
Armed with so much evidence, detectives finally get the chance to sit down face to face with their suspect. Would Donna Perry admit to the crimes that Douglas Perry had committed all those years ago?
She was in the room by herself. And so then I just waited for a little bit. Then I went back in with this. And I read it to her. And when I read that the charge was murder, she said, "Murder? Murder? Who am I supposed to have murdered? Murder?"
Am I being accused of murder or something?
Yes, that is you are the prime suspect.
What is this related to?
Not just one murder, but several.
But you're accusing me of murder. Of who?
It was an unusual case, to be sure. A woman denying having been the man who had killed 3 sex workers. Would detectives convince Donna Perry to confess? Under interrogation, Donna Perry admitted that as Doug, she paid for the services of prostitutes, but denied causing them any harm.
No, I, as a male human being, I did pick up some prostitutes, yes. But when I always let them out, keep alive and well when I let them out.
It's clear that she is going to distance herself from that. She knows nothing about it. I don't know who killed these women. I've never seen these women, she says. I'm not going to admit to killing anyone because I haven't.
How many many times would you say you dated a prostitute other than Claire Ann?
Not very many, a couple, 2 or 3 times maybe. I didn't have the money. But Social Security at that time was only what? Just a little over $700.
Did you ever take any of these prostitutes home to have sex with them?
No.
Was that normal for you? Or?
No.
I got individual photographs of 13 women, all of whom were from, were hookers back in 1990. Knowing that Perry associated with them, some of them, he was using hookers himself back in those days.
I've got some photographs here I'd like to show you that may help refresh your memory. And the reason why I want to show you these photographs is I know that in the 90s, you dated some prostitutes.
And the purpose was quite simple, really, when it came right down to it, was to show him these photographs, these photographs one at a time, and have her declare, do you know this person? Have you ever seen him? If she knows the person, how do you know him? You know, how close were, you know, we'd explore each of those. In this case, every single one, she said, nope, never seen him.
Do you know that person?
No.
And this is number 2.
Oh, God, no. No, I didn't date black girls.
Including the victims that were randomly spread out. I just put them up there. Ever seen this person? Nope, never seen him. Never seen him, never seen him. Until I showed him Yolanda Sapp, and then he said, no, she's black. I would never have anything to do with a black person. The question, obviously, is if you have never had any contact with any of these victims, how does your DNA get on?
Even when presented with all of the forensic evidence, Donna had an explanation. She knew the murdered girls.
They ran the DNA, full male profile DNA that was found on the subject. Okay. And that came back, when they ran it in CODIS, it came back as a match.
It wouldn't surprise me if you found fingerprints and stuff on these hookers. I would have sex with them, release them, go home.
Donna refused to admit that she'd killed Yolanda Sapp, Nikki Lowe, and Kathy Brisboe. But her denial came with a twist that detectives weren't expecting.
I'm not going to admit I killed anybody. I didn't. Donna has killed nobody. I don't know if Doug did or not. It's 20 years ago, and I have no idea whether he did or didn't. Well, if you have proof that I murdered someone, I can't remember.
Donna was accusing Douglas Perry of the murders. It was an outlandish defense, but would it get Donna off the hook?
Donna versus Doug. Donna didn't do it, but Douglas did, and so you can't convict me because I'm Donna. Douglas did it.
Could detectives find a line of questioning that would draw out an admission of guilt?
People that kill people, multiple people over periods of time, they generally keep going once it starts.
Yeah.
So the question to me as a law enforcement officer who studied this in depth, what made Donna stop?
This is a clever interview trick because cops say that when you ask that kind of a question, you can sometimes get the killer to admit to the killings, or you can find out that the killer never did stop, and maybe there are other murders that they didn't know about.
Perry's answer was revealing.
So then I asked myself,
Douglas didn't stop. Donna stopped it. The gender change operation, I have not doubt. I'm convinced of it.
Donna Perry gets upset and she blurts out, Doug didn't stop it, Donna did. Boom. Huge. That was a confession.
Donna insisted that the sex change operation had brought about a huge transformation.
Donna Perry claims that one of the reasons why she had that sex change operation was that she felt that if she had her genitals taken away as a man and got rid of that portion of her life, then she wouldn't be as violent. She wouldn't have that desire anymore to kill.
I got rid of the violence, sex change operation. I was getting the emotional.
Here's what I'm wondering too is
There's no more testosterone to fuel the anger.
So you think that changing from Doug So Donna stopped your anger?
I was paranoid as hell and emotional as hell, but I won't hurt anybody.
She believed that her gender reassignment surgery drew a curtain, and nothing before that occasion, she wasn't responsible. That was somebody else's doing.
Should Donna really be held accountable for Doug's actions?
When I first heard is that, Donna's gonna say Doug did it, and Doug's gonna say Donna did it, and we're gonna get in a big brouhaha in court as to, they're gonna fight back and forth, and it's not really gonna go anywhere.
Can somebody who identified themselves at one point in their life as a man now identify themselves as a woman and say, I'm changed, I haven't done those activities, and that's not me. Douglas Perry is dead.
You didn't get rid of what Doug did before the sex change. That remains.
No,
maybe nothing else of him remains, but that does.
And you're going to punish Donna. Is that it?
Yes, the body is accountable.
Body is even the same thing.
This would continue to be Donna Perry's defense throughout her trial. But if she thought it would get her off scot-free, she was wrong.
Donna Perry claims that when a person goes from being male to being female, there's a great downturn in violence. Experts say that just isn't true. In closing arguments, one of the prosecutors said she gelded herself like you would a farm animal.
Prosecutors called upon the testimony of Doug's cellmate, the man who had claimed that Perry had confessed to 9 murders back in 1998. But the most damning evidence against him proved to be that DNA collected by Kathy Brisboe. DNA which might not have been matched but for the mistake that Donna Perry made of being caught in a shop with guns. It was a mistake which led to a DNA swab being taken and a link being made to that found under the fingernails of Kathy Brisboe.
This is a case of the specific DNA being able to give us a suspect, and in this case, the actual killer, where fingerprints and other things probably would have failed. So when the DNA is developed to the point where it's as sensitive as it is, then we have a suspect that we would not have found. Never would have found him without it.
You pick up a piece of evidence, you say to yourself, you better mark this, you better do it the right way, because somewhere down the line there's going to be a defense attorney that's going to take a look at that and question you about everything you did with that piece of evidence. So hearing about it was great. I just felt that was going to happen. So it's hard to argue with DNA evidence.
Without the DNA, Perry would certainly be free, yeah.
Perry was found guilty of 3 counts of murder and given 3 life sentences without parole.
You kill somebody, you're going to get caught. And I don't care if you go to the extent of changing your sex by surgery or not, or color your face or cut your hair, you're going to get caught.
Doug Perry could have got away with murder. For 22 years, the police had no more leads to follow. But despite becoming Donna, she couldn't leave her old self behind. Her obsession with weapons led to another felony conviction. And when a DNA swab was taken, it gave cold case detectives the breakthrough that they'd been waiting for. That was the killer's mistake, and ultimately, Donna's downfall.